They say Duke Lucian Varellis once made a man confess to treason simply by entering the room. No blade, no threat spoken aloud, just the particular way he occupied silence, like something ancient that had learned to wear a human face. Tonight, the entire North trembles beneath his shadow, and one woman is about to do the single most dangerous thing any living creature can attempt inside Castle Varellis. She is going to save his life, and he is going to make her regret it in ways neither of them can yet imagine. Stay until the end. What happens next will rearrange everything you believe about power. Heat. The Winter Dominion Ball began, as all great performances of cruelty did, with music. Strings rose through the vaulted hall of Castle Varellis like smoke from a controlled fire. Elegant, precise, designed to fill lungs and leave no room for independent thought. 300 candles burned in the iron chandeliers overhead, their light the color of old gold, flattering to titled faces and merciless to everything below. The black stone walls absorbed the warmth before it could reach the floor, and down at floor level, where the servants moved in careful orbits between noble ankles and trailing gown hems, the temperature remained exactly what it had always been inside this castle. Cold enough to remind you of your place. Seraphine Vale understood cold. She had understood it since she was 7 years old and first learned that the worst chill had nothing to do with temperature. It had to do with being looked through. Standing in the same room as a person who had decided, completely and without cruelty's effort, that you simply did not register as worth acknowledging. That particular cold sat behind the sternum and stayed there. It became structural eventually, part of the skeleton. She carried her tray of wine goblets across the marble floor with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years perfecting the science of not existing. Head angled down, shoulders neither rounded nor rigid, the exact posture of a background object. Her dress was the deep charcoal gray of the House Varellis livery, worn thin at both elbows, and her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of severity that suggested she'd stopped trying to look like anything other than functional. The scarred skin on her left hand, a network of old burns that crawled from her palm to her wrist. She kept turned inward, pressed against the tray's underside. It was a survival instinct she'd developed long before she understood it consciously. Visible scars invited questions. Questions invited attention. Attention was the enemy. Around her, the Empire's finest conducted their annual ritual of performing wealth at one another. Lady Margot Fontaine wore a gown that cost more than the northern grain harvest of any single village. She laughed too loudly at something Count Aldrich said, the sound like crystal striking stone, calibrated for maximum notice. The Count himself had the particular expression of a man who understood that his relevance to this gathering depended entirely on proximity to more powerful men, and he was working it with the quiet desperation of someone bailing water from a very slow, sinking vessel. 3 noble women near the eastern column watched Seraphine pass. They didn't lower their voices. "That one has the hands of a kitchen scullion," the tallest said. Honestly, where does Steward Renaud find them? From the gutter district, I assume. They breed desperation there. This from the woman in emerald, who sipped wine with the detached authority of someone accustomed to being agreed with. Someone should tell her that threadbare is a statement, not a fashion. Soft laughter. Not aimed at Seraphine specifically, more in her direction, the way you'd toss scraps towards something you hadn't decided yet whether to feed or ignore. Seraphine moved through it without expression. She had long since made peace with the particular arithmetic of this existence. If you reacted, you became a problem. Problems got removed. Removal meant losing the position. Losing the position meant losing the one thing that had kept her fed and sheltered and close enough to the information that mattered. And information, she had learned, was the only currency that never devalued. She was reaching the northern end of the banquet table, the Duke's end, where the silver service gleamed and the goblets were of a heavier, older make than anything offered to lesser guests, when she heard the shift in the hall. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of certain sounds, and their replacement with something else, the way a room full of predators might change texture when the largest one moved. Lucien Varellis entered through the side door that connected directly to his private corridor, and the Winter Dominion Ball remembered, immediately and collectively, why it had come here tonight. He was not, by any conventional metric, the most physically imposing man Seraphine had ever seen. He was tall, yes, several inches above the average nobleman, built with the particular leanness of someone whose body had never been indulged in softness. His hair was black, cropped close on the sides, and his jaw carried 3 days of deliberate neglect. The House Varellis formal coat was deep charcoal, almost identical in color to the servant's livery, which Seraphine had always privately thought was not coincidence. A man who dressed almost like his own servants was a man who understood how power worked at close range. But it wasn't his height or his bearing or even the notoriously flat darkness of his eyes that made the hall realign itself around his entrance. It was the quality of his attention. When Lucien Varellis looked at a thing, he consumed it, not with warmth or interest. Those were the currencies of men who needed something from you. His gaze was purely analytical, the inspection of someone cataloging variables in a problem that only he had been bothered to notice. He crossed the floor toward his seat at the head of the banquet table, and the crowd parted not because protocol demanded it, but because remaining in the path of that particular attention felt, at a cellular level, unwise. Seraphine kept her eyes down. She adjusted her grip on the tray. She had been a maid in Castle Varellis for 14 months. In that time, she had been in the same room as the Duke perhaps 40 or 50 times. She had served his table on 11 separate occasions. She had been noticed by him exactly never, which was the precise outcome she had worked to achieve, and which tonight she needed to maintain with particular care given what she had discovered 3 hours ago in the wine steward's private cellar. The goblet at the Duke's place setting, the one already filled, already waiting, placed by a servant Seraphine had watched accept a folded note from a stranger's hand near the eastern gate at dusk, needed to not reach his lips. The problem was doing something about it without becoming visible. The problem was that in this room, invisible and capable were mutually exclusive. Lucien settled into the carved chair at the head of the table with the economy of movement that characterized everything he did. No performance, no acknowledgement of the hall's attention. He dragged the silver goblet toward him with 2 fingers, an almost lazy gesture, the motion of a man entirely unbothered by the 300 people watching his every breath, and his gaze traveled across the assembled guests with the disinterest of a man reviewing inventory he'd already decided wasn't worth purchasing. Seraphine was 5 feet away. The goblet was already rising. She moved before the thought completed itself. The tray went down, abandoned on the nearest flat surface, the edge of the banquet table, where it landed with a soft metallic sound that nobody would have registered under the music except she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 14 months studying this room's acoustics, that the Duke registered everything. Her right hand closed around the stem of his goblet just below his fingers. The goblet came down. Not violently. Not with the theatrical crash of a dramatic intervention. She controlled it, redirected it, her palm meeting the base and pressing it downward with a firm and deliberate motion that could not be mistaken for accident. Wine spread across the white linen in a dark stain shaped like an accusation. The strings stopped. Or perhaps they didn't stop. Perhaps the music continued unchanged. But in the particular bubble that formed around the head of the table in the half-second following, everything that wasn't the Duke's eyes went entirely silent. Lucien Varellis looked at his hand, then at the spreading wine. Then, with the slow and measuring patience of a man deciding exactly how interested he was in a problem before committing to engage with it, at Seraphine, she was still holding the goblet stem. She realized this. Her fingers released it. The hall had, in fact, gone genuinely quiet now. The music continued somewhere behind them. She could feel the vibration in the floor. But human sound had evacuated the room the way animals vacated a field before a storm. "A maid," Lucien said, "who forgets her place." His voice was low, not angry. Anger required investment, and his voice suggested a man making a purely academic observation. "Becomes trash beneath the throne." The words landed with the weight of a door closing. From the gathered nobility, carefully delayed enough to be plausibly spontaneous, laughter emerged. Lady Margot from behind her fan. Count Aldrich, with the particular enthusiasm of a man grateful to have something to align with. The emerald-gowned woman near the eastern column, who didn't laugh so much as smile in the way that indicated she found other people's diminishment nutritionally satisfying. Seraphine's knees hit the marble. She had made the calculation before her hands moved. The calculation was simple and brutal and required no deliberation. The cost of acting was humiliation. The cost of not acting was a dead duke and a sequence of political consequences that she had spent 14 months studying and which would fall on people who were not Duke Lucien Varellis, but who existed underneath him in all the ways that mattered. She knelt on the marble floor of the Winter Dominion Ball. She looked at the wine-stained linen. She kept her scarred hand pressed against her thigh and did not look up. The laughter continued for 3.5 seconds before the banquet hall doors came off their hinges. Not metaphorically. The great iron-banded doors of the Varellis banquet hall, each one a foot thick, weighing 400 pounds, swung on hinges that had opened and closed 10,000 times without drama, came open with the kind of force that had nothing to do with ceremony. They opened because the men on the other side had decided they were going to open, and the four-house Varellis sentries posted at the entrance had made the very rapid calculation that stepping in front of soldiers wearing imperial crimson was an excellent way to be stepped on. 12 guards marched in formation across the marble floor. Their armor was the deep red of the imperial crown, not the Northern Territory's colors, not any provincial house sigil. The silver crest at the center of each breastplate caught the candlelight and held it, and Seraphine felt the sound leave the room entirely as the commander of the formation, a broad-shouldered man with gray threading his temples, scanned the hall and found what he was looking for. He found Seraphine. Still kneeling on the marble, the commander approached without deviation, and the crowd separated before him the way water separated before stone, and when he reached the place where Seraphine knelt, he stopped. And behind him his 11 soldiers stopped, and in a single synchronized movement that had clearly been practiced until it became instinct, 12 imperial guardsmen knelt, every knee on the marble floor, every head bowed, directly before the maid with the scarred hand and the threadbare dress. "Your Highness," the commander's voice carried across every inch of the silent hall, "we have searched 5 years for your return." The music had stopped, this time for real. Seraphine did not move. She did not stand. She did not look up immediately because she had spent 5 years teaching herself never to react to the first development in any situation. The first development was always the one designed to provoke a response, and responses were the mechanism through which you lost control of what happened next. She lifted her gaze slowly. Lucien Varellis had not moved from his chair. His hand rested near the wine-stained linen. The goblet she had pushed down sat on its side 3 inches from his fingers, still slowly dripping. His face held the expression she had studied from safe distance for 14 months, the one that looked like indifference, and was, she had come to understand, something far more calculated than that. He was thinking, fast and very hard, and not showing a single degree of it. Around the hall, 300 members of the Northern Empire's nobility stood in the particular paralysis of people who had just watched the world reorganize itself into a shape they didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Lady Margot's fan was closed. Count Aldrich had gone the color of old candle wax. The emerald-gowned woman near the eastern column looked like she'd swallowed something wrong. Seraphine rose from the floor. She did it without hurrying. One knee, then the other, then upright. The exact motion she'd performed in this hall 50 or 60 times before, pushing herself up from a position of service. Except this time the geometry of the room had entirely rearranged itself around her, and she was no longer rising toward the floor. She was rising toward something else. She faced the commander. "You have the wrong person," she said. It was the right thing to say. She had considered, in the fraction of time between his words and her response, what options existed, and this was the one that cost the least while buying the most time. The commander reached into the armor at his chest and produced a document sealed in imperial wax. The old seal, she noted. The one that predated the current regent's administration by at least 12 years. He held it out, and it was the gesture of a man delivering an object he had guarded with his life for reasons he fully understood. "We were given the seal, Your Highness, and the marks." His eyes dropped, briefly, to her left hand, to the scars. Seraphine did not look at the document. She looked at the Duke. Lucien Varellis met her gaze across the width of the banquet table, across the overturned goblet and the spreading wine and the 14 months of invisible service and the 300 frozen witnesses, and something happened in the space between them that she couldn't have named then and would spend weeks afterward trying to articulate. He was recalibrating, not panicking, not calculating advantage in the crude way that smaller men would have immediately begun doing. She could see, in the rigid attention of Count Aldrich and the quickly hidden calculation in Lady Margot's eyes, exactly how lesser political animals were already beginning to process the profit potential of this moment. The Duke was doing something else. He was looking at her the way she imagined a cartographer might look at a map that had suddenly revealed a continent that shouldn't exist. The pure, almost offended attentiveness of someone whose model of the world had just required significant revision. "Commander," Lucian said. Every head in the hall turned toward him. "Clear my guests." The noise that followed, the shuffle and protest and anxious query of 300 noble bodies being politely but absolutely directed toward exits, seemed to happen at a remove from the space Seraphine occupied. She stood in the center of the emptying hall and watched the marble floor reveal itself in sections as the crowd thinned, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she did not allow herself to feel anything that she couldn't immediately identify and categorize. Fear, present, manageable, calculation, running. Something else underneath both of those. Something she had no name for yet, which was the most dangerous kind of thing to be carrying. When the last guest had been ushered through the side corridors, and the Imperial guards had assumed posts at the hall's perimeter, 12 men standing with the absolute stillness of those accustomed to guarding things worth dying over, Lucien rose from his chair. He was taller standing. She had known this intellectually, but the room was different now without its populated buffer, and the distance between the head of the table and where she stood was maybe 20 feet of empty marble and open air. He walked it slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on her face the entire time. He stopped 6 feet away and studied her with the unself-conscious directness of a man who had never once found another person's discomfort inconvenient. "The marks," he said. Not a question. Seraphine turned her left hand over. The scars caught the candlelight, the network of burns that she had understood for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, were not from a kitchen accident. They were from a seal, pressed into the skin of a 7-year-old child by a man who had wanted to ensure that if the girl survived, she could be found, or if necessary, proven. Lucian looked at her hand for a long time, then at her face. The inspection was so thorough that it felt tactile. "You saved my life," he said, "and then lied to an Imperial commander." "I didn't lie." Her voice came out level. Remarkable, given that her entire chest felt pressurized. "I said you had the wrong person. That remains a matter of interpretation." Something crossed his face, so quickly that she wasn't certain it happened. A fractional movement around the mouth that was not quite amusement and not quite anything else. An Imperial heir who argues semantics with soldiers. A maid learns quickly that specific language is the difference between keeping a position and losing one. The hall was quiet enough that she could hear the candles burning. "Someone tried to poison me tonight," Lucian said. "Yes. You knew before they attempted it." "I knew 3 hours before they attempted it." His eyes didn't change, but something in the air around him did. A tightening of attention. A focusing of that analytical quality she had spent 14 months cataloging from safe distances. Then why did you wait? It was, she had to concede, the right question. The question that cut directly to the piece of this situation that she had hoped he might not reach tonight, because answering it required revealing more than she'd planned to reveal, and revealing things was the mechanism through which you lost control of. "Because I needed to know," she said. "Who handed the note to your wine steward?" Silence. "And did you?" "Count Aldrich Fenburn." His seal. "Carried by a messenger wearing unmarked livery who entered through the eastern gate at dusk and was admitted by your third watch gate captain." The Duke did not visibly react. This was, she had observed, his primary method of exercising power in conversation. He received information without the normal human behavioral signals that indicated receipt, which created in the person delivering it a compulsive need to continue speaking, to offer more, to fill the silence with something that might produce visible acknowledgement. She had specifically prepared for this tactic. She waited. 14 months, Lucian said finally. 14 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. You've been in my house for 14 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Cleaning your floors, yes. As a maid. As a maid. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man running complex arithmetic. Why Varellis? It was the question underneath the question, not why she had come here specifically, which was logistically answerable, but why here? Why him? Why the North? Why the most feared house in the frontier territories of an empire that had spent 5 years pretending the massacre of the imperial family was a tragic accident rather than a political execution? Seraphine thought about the 7-year-old who had run from a burning palace through a servant's corridor, guided by a woman whose name she never learned, delivered eventually to a network of anonymous hands that moved her systematically farther from the capital until she was someone different in a place no one would look. She thought about the years after, the careful accretion of identity, the discipline required to exist in plain sight, the education she'd collected in pieces from every household she'd worked in. She thought about what she'd understood by year 3 in service that she could never have understood from a throne. Because, she said, the empire doesn't watch what it doesn't value, and I needed to watch the empire. Something shifted in the space between them. Not warmth. She was not prepared to call it that, and didn't think it was, but a kind of acknowledgement. The specific quality of recognition between two people who have each, separately, arrived at the same understanding of how the world actually functions and are mildly startled to find the other one there. The regent will know by morning, Lucien said. Before morning. He has a correspondent in this hall, Lady Fontaine's companion, the quiet one near the window who didn't drink tonight. She'll have sent word before your guards finish clearing the room. This time, the fractional movement around his mouth lasted a full half-second. You've been busy. I've been thorough, she said. There's a difference. He turned away from her then, not dismissively, but with the deliberate quality of a man processing something that required motion. He walked to the overturned goblet on the banquet table and picked it up, turned it in his hands, set it upright. The gesture was almost domestic, entirely out of place in this man, on this night, and she suspected he knew it. The Imperial Guardsmen outside will need accommodations, he said, in the tone of someone making a statement about weather. They'll need more than accommodations. They'll need walls. He turned back toward her. You're asking me to protect you. I'm informing you, Seraphine said carefully, of what the next 48 hours will require if neither of us wants to spend them dead. There's a distinction. Yes, you're very certain of that distinction. I've been making it for 5 years, she said, between things that are given and things that are taken, between position and power, between existing and surviving. The hall's cold had fully settled into her now. The real cold. The stone and night and winter cold, not the other kind. Her fingers were numb. She didn't show it. I am not asking you for protection, Duke Varellis. I'm offering you the most valuable political resource in the Empire in exchange for walls that are already standing. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had texture, weight. Lucien Varellis studied her for what felt like a very long time and was probably 15 seconds. What resource? Me, she said, and everything I know about who killed my family and why. She watched him weigh it. She watched the calculation move through his eyes with the cleanness of water moving over stone, rapid, direct, entirely without the self-deceiving fog that most people allowed into their decision-making because it made the decisions feel more human. And if I decide the resource isn't worth the walls? He asked. She had prepared for this too, had thought it through with the same exhaustive thoroughness she'd applied to everything for 5 years. Then I walk out of your northern gate in the morning, she said, and the next house I approach will have this conversation instead of you, and they'll have it with the knowledge that House Varellis had the lost imperial heir in its kitchens for 14 months and let her leave. The fractional movement at his mouth was back. Political leverage, he said, on top of an offer of political leverage. I learned from observation, she said. I observed very effective practitioners. Whatever she had expected from that, dismissal, calculation, perhaps a return to the cold contempt of his public performance, It was not what happened. What happened was that Lucien Varellis laughed. Not loudly. Not the performed laughter of someone who wanted to be seen laughing. A short, genuine, slightly disbelieving sound that lasted barely 2 seconds, and which he seemed mildly annoyed to find himself producing. "The regent is going to send an army," he said. "Yes. To my door. Within the week, based on current troop deployment patterns, which I have some data on." "Of course you do." "Third shelf from the left in your Western archives," she said, "behind the tax records from the year before last. The troop manifests aren't filed where your steward thinks they are." The annoyance in his expression deepened into something that was, she thought, reluctant appreciation. "You've been in my archives. I cleaned them every Tuesday for 14 months. A pause. "Your filing system is terrible." He looked at her for another long moment. "You have 2 conditions," he said, and it was not a question. It was a man who had reached a decision and was confirming the terms before executing it. 2. State them. First, whatever arrangement exists between us is exactly that, an arrangement, not wardship, not custody, not whatever the political vocabulary chooses to call it. I am not a resource to be managed. I am a party to an agreement." He didn't blink. "Second, the wine steward is released before morning." He didn't know what was in the note. He accepted money from a messenger and believed he was delivering a request for a private meeting. He has a daughter in the Mill district and a mother who's been ill for 6 months. She held his gaze. He didn't know. Something moved in Lucian's expression that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not softness. She would have recognized and distrusted softness. Something more like the adjusting of an instrument that had been previously calibrated for different input. "You're protecting a servant," he said. "I was a servant." "You're an imperial heir." "I was both," she said. "I know which one taught me anything worth knowing." The hall was entirely silent around them. The 12 imperial guards stood at their posts with the trained vacancy of men paid to not hear. The candles had burned another hour's worth lower during their conversation, and the shadows in the corners of the hall had grown toward the center, and the marble floor between them held the last faint stain of spilled wine. "Accepted," Lucian said. One word, no elaboration. She had expected negotiation, had prepared for it. The absence of it was, she registered, itself a kind of power. "I'll have the household steward arrange rooms," he said, "not the servants' quarters." "The servants' quarters are fine." "They're not. I don't need—" "They're not fine," he said, and his voice had the quality of a door being closed. "Because the people who want you dead will search there first, and they know every entry point in this castle. The East Tower has 1 corridor, 1 stairwell, and 3 walls that back against solid rock. It is the second most defensible room in Varellis. You'll take it." She considered arguing, calculated the cost-benefit. "Let it go." "And the most defensible?" she asked. "Mine," he said, and turned away. 3 weeks passed in the castle before Seraphine understood what she had walked into. She had understood the political geometry immediately, of course. She had spent 14 months studying it from below, and the view from the East Tower was simply the same geometry from a higher elevation. The northern nobility circled the castle like wolves who had caught a scent, close enough to position themselves, far enough to deny it. Messages arrived every day. Lords who wanted audience with the Duke, lords who wanted audience with her, lords who wanted to be photographed standing near the tower and having it noticed. None of them wanted what they said they wanted. She'd learned that early. What people said they wanted was almost never it. Beneath the request was always the architecture of need, and beneath the need was always the oldest question of survival. Who do I attach myself to before the walls fall? The walls in this case being the walls of House Varellis' current political position, which had become, overnight, the most contested real estate in the empire. Lucien managed it the way she imagined he managed everything, with the kind of decisive brutality that eliminated the need for extensive deliberation. 3 Lord Messengers were turned away from the castle gate with notes that contained, by report of the castle's servants, precisely 14 words each. Count Aldrich Fenburn received a somewhat different communication, a single-page document delivered by the Duke's personal aide that she was privately informed caused the Count to leave his own morning reception without excusing himself and not return for 2 hours. She didn't ask what the document contained. She had a reasonable estimate. What she was less prepared for was the Duke himself, at close range, over time. In the hall, at distance, during formal occasions, Lucien Varellis was entirely legible. He was the thing his reputation said he was: cold, strategic, capable of cruelty with the detached efficiency of a man trimming a garden, not from anger, but because certain elements needed removal for the overall design to function. She understood this. She had observed it. She had planned for it. She had not entirely planned for the version of him that appeared in the castle's corridors at odd hours. She found him in the Western Library at 2 a.m. on the 4th night of her stay, standing at the window that overlooked the northern courtyard with a book closed in his hand. He hadn't heard her come in, or had heard her and chosen not to indicate it, which with him was frequently indistinguishable. She had been unable to sleep and had wanted the maps in the Eastern case, specifically the decade-old provincial surveys that would tell her things about military road conditions that the official manifests wouldn't. She crossed the room toward the Eastern cases without speaking. Behind her, after a moment, "The Ashwick survey is mislabeled." She stopped. "Third shelf," he said, still facing the window. "Second from the left. It's filed under North March trade routes. It's actually the military access survey from 12 years ago." "I know," she said. "I filed it there." A pause. "To hide it?" "To make it findable only by someone who already knew what they were looking for." She heard him turn from the window. "And who were you expecting to be looking for it?" She pulled the survey from the third shelf, second from left, and turned. He was watching her from across the room with the quality of attention that she had decided, by the 4th day, was simply native to him. Not performative, not designed to intimidate, just the natural result of a mind that was always running faster than its context and using available visual input to maintain pace. "Me," she said, "eventually." "You intended to come back." "I intended to be ready if I did." The library was cold and dark except for the lamp he'd brought, which sat on the reading table and threw long shadows across the shelves. He looked at her across that distance with an expression that contained, she thought, genuine curiosity. The uncomplicated kind, the kind that preceded judgment rather than following it. "You planned for contingencies," he said. "I've been planning for contingencies since I was 7. The hidden marks, the archives, the wine steward, the 6 other locations and 6 other noble houses where I have left similar data caches," she said. "The 3 individuals in 3 separate cities who know a specific phrase that will activate specific protocols if I fail to send a particular message every 30 days. Silence. "Fail-safes," he said. 14 months in your house," she said. "I didn't spend all of it cleaning." He crossed to the reading table and sat on its edge, the gesture so casual and so entirely unlike the rigid formality of his public bearing that she almost didn't recognize it, and looked at the floor for a moment in the specific way of someone recalibrating a complex model. "You've been building a network," he said. "I've been building options. How many people know who you are?" 3 now. Previously, 0. The guards know their orders. They don't know my history. The commander knows what he needs to know to execute his mission. He doesn't know what I know about the regent, or what I know about the massacre, or what I know about the 7 men who were present in that palace the night my family died. Lucian looked up at her. 7, he said. "I've had 5 years to research," she said, "and a very good memory." He was quiet for a moment that felt like it had more mass than normal moments. "The regent is one," he said. "The regent gave the order. He didn't plan it. He's a facilitator, not an architect." She set the survey down on the nearest shelf and met his gaze directly. "The man who planned it is currently sitting on the High Council. He's been there for 4 years. He's moderately liked and considered politically moderate, and no one in the Empire suspects him because no one in the Empire knows to look at him. And you do." "I watched him from a corridor window when I was 7 years old," she said, "signing documents at my father's desk while my father's body was still in the room. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of a man choosing not to say several things. choosing instead the one thing that was most precisely what he meant. "Then you don't just want protection," he said. "No. You want a weapon." She considered the word, its precision, its limitations. "I want," she said carefully, "what I've wanted since I was 7 years old, hiding in a servant's corridor with blood on my shoes. I want it to matter. The surviving. All of it. I want the years and the cold and the invisible and the kneeling on marble floors to have been worth something more than not dying." The lamp flickered between them. The castle around them was silent in the way of very old stone buildings. Not empty silent, but heavy silent, the weight of centuries pressing down into quiet. Lucien looked at her for a long time. "That's not a weapon," he said finally. "That's a purpose. Most people can't tell the difference." "No," he said. "They can't." He stood from the table's edge, took his lamp, moved toward the library door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "The survey," he said. "The Ashwick military roads. The western passage near Fenbrook has been impassable for 2 seasons. If the regent deploys from the southern garrisons, he'll be forced north by northeast. That route runs directly past the Varellis forward lines." He didn't look back at her. "In case," he said, "that's useful." He left. Seraphine stood in the dark library for a long moment. Then she sat down at the reading table, opened the mislabeled survey, and began to work. By the end of the 2nd week, she understood something she hadn't expected to understand. She had expected the castle to be what it looked like from below. Cold, transactional, a machine for the production of dominance. She had expected the Duke to be his reputation, reduced and functional. She had expected to spend these weeks in the East Tower cataloging what she knew, building toward the moment when the regent made his move, and the sequence she had spent 5 years designing could begin to execute. She had not expected the castle to be occupied by people. That sounds simple. It wasn't. She knew intellectually that households were populated. But there was a difference between knowing a household was populated and understanding the way that specific population existed. The dozen stable hands who had developed an elaborate unofficial schedule to ensure that the oldest among them, a man named Thomas, who'd been at Varellis for 40 years and whose knees were failing, never had to manage the north yard in the hardest frost hours. The kitchen girl who was teaching herself to read using documents she'd stolen from the recycling bin and who hid the lessons inside a loose stone in the scullery wall. The castle's head of security, a woman named Petra, who ran the night watch with complete authority and who also, Seraphine observed, left a covered plate of food outside a specific unused door every 3rd evening. She asked one of the junior maids about the door. "Old man in there," the maid said, with the particular brevity of someone who had long since made peace with unusual information. "Former Duke's secretary. Duke lets him stay. He's got nowhere else." Seraphine filed this in the same category as the wine steward's release, which had happened exactly as agreed before morning on the first night. She had not been informed directly. She had learned it from the servants' network, which operated on its own efficient information channels that had nothing to do with formal communication structures. She filed it, and she thought about it, and she did not draw conclusions from it because she was not yet in a position to trust conclusions. On the 15th day, she came down from the tower for the evening meal and found the east corridor blocked by 3 of the castle's armed household guard. Not the formal military contingent, but the internal security unit, Petra's people, surrounding a man she didn't recognize who was explaining, with increasing volume and decreasing coherence, that he had a private message for the resident guest from Lord Aldrich Fenburn. Seraphine stopped in the shadows of the upper corridor and watched. Petra listened to the messenger for exactly 30 seconds. "No one," Petra said, "enters the east corridor without the Duke's authorization. Lord Fenburn is aware of this condition." The message is, "Lord Fenburn," Petra said, "is also aware that continuing to attempt unauthorized contact with the East Corridor's resident is the kind of activity that tends to result in the Duke becoming aware of Lord Fenburn's ongoing activities, which is the kind of awareness Lord Fenburn has historically gone to some lengths to avoid." The messenger left. Seraphine went back upstairs and sat with that for a while. She thought about what it meant for a man to have built this This specific configuration of people who operated on his behalf, not from fear alone, but from the kind of functional loyalty that came from years of consistent expectations and consistent delivery on those expectations. She had assumed, from below, that the castle ran on fear. She was revising that model. It ran on something more efficient than fear. It ran on the knowledge that Lucien Varellis was the most dependable constant in the lives of everyone inside his walls. That was, she thought, a far more interesting and far more dangerous quality than cruelty. On the 17th day, she came downstairs at dawn and found him in the courtyard. He was training. Alone, or nearly alone, the two guards maintaining perimeter distance with the professional invisibility of people accustomed to giving their employer space. He moved through a sword form she didn't recognize, with the kind of concentrated economy that indicated something he'd done long enough that it had stopped being exercise and become something else. Something like thinking done with the body instead of the mind. She stood in the covered walkway and watched for a few minutes. He was very good. She had understood this abstractly from reports and from the cold efficiency of his reputation in battle. Watching it had a different quality. There was nothing performative in it. No audience, no exhibition. It was the practice of someone who understood that capability was only ever the product of daily maintenance, and who found in that maintenance something that looked, from the right angle, like the closest he got to stillness. She was about to turn back inside when he spoke without stopping or turning toward her. The regent's courier arrived at dawn. She stepped out into the courtyard cold. The gates were not opened. He finished the form, lowered the blade. He left a document at the guard post. My aide has it. What does it say? He finally turned toward her. His breath misted in the cold morning air. The sword at his side caught the new light. It says, he said, with the quality of reading something from memory rather than feeling, that the continued harboring of an individual under contested imperial claim status constitutes an actionable breach of the Varellis territorial charter, and that the Crown Council formally requests surrender of the aforementioned individual pending adjudication of hereditary status. A pause. It's a very elegant way, Seraphine said, of saying they're coming. They're coming, he agreed. She looked at him across the courtyard. The cold was real and sharp and full in her lungs. Then you should surrender me, she said, politically speaking, before they reach your walls. The cost of compliance now is lower than the cost of resistance later. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. The word landed. I should, he agreed. Politically speaking. He sheathed the sword. Have your morning meal, he said. Then I'd like you in the strategy room. I'm closing the northern gates this afternoon. She stood in the courtyard cold and watched him walk back toward the castle's interior. It was the 17th day since the Winter Dominion Ball. In 3 hours, Lucien Varellis would lock his gates against the imperial regent's authority and declare military sovereignty over the north. In 6 hours, the first messages would go out to allied lords, some by invitation, some by threat. The precise ratio calibrated by the Duke with the kind of grim efficiency she was beginning to recognize as his primary creative mode. In 4 days, the regent would begin moving troops. None of that was what occupied her attention as she turned to follow him inside. What occupied her attention was the particular quality of the silence he'd left behind in the courtyard. Not empty, but full of the specific weight of a man who had made a decision that had nothing to do with the political calculation he'd just correctly articulated. She had told him on the first night that she wasn't asking for protection. She was becoming increasingly unsure that what was happening here was accurately described by either party's stated terms. She went inside. She ate. She went to the strategy room. Lucien was already there, bent over the campaign maps with Petra and his military advisor, and he looked up when she entered with the same quality of attention he'd given her on the first night, not as a managed person, not as a political resource, but as someone whose presence in the room altered its calculation in a way he found, against all apparent preference, useful. The Western Road, he said. Tell me what you know about Fenbrook. She crossed to the table, looked at the map, found Fenbrook, and began. She did not think about what it meant that for the first time in 5 years she was building something instead of surviving it. She did not let herself think about it. She would think about it later. Probably when the army arrived. The message arrived at midnight on the 22nd day, slipped under the East Tower door without knock or announcement. A single folded page. No seal. She recognized the handwriting before she finished unfolding it. She had seen it once before, on a document signed at her father's desk 12 years ago, while his body was still in the room. The message was 8 words. I know what you remember. Surrender or I will. She stood at the tower window overlooking the northern courtyard, holding that page in her scarred hand, and looked out at the castle walls, at the lights in the guard towers, at the specific configuration of a place that had, in 22 days, stopped feeling like a temporary position and started feeling like something she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She looked at the handwriting. 8 words. She turned from the window and went to find the Duke. She needed him to know that the man she was hunting had just confirmed in his own hand that he knew exactly where she was, which meant the regent wasn't simply coming. He was already here. Someone inside the walls of Castle Varellis was feeding her location to the architect of her family's murder, and she had exactly until morning to find out who. She didn't run. Running was what prey did, and Seraphine had spent 5 years unlearning the instinct with the same grinding discipline she'd applied to everything else that might get her killed. She walked from the East Tower to the Duke's private corridor with the note folded in her fist and her heartbeat doing something she refused to call panic, because panic was information you acted on without processing it first, and unprocessed information was how you died. 8 words. She counted her steps instead. 43 from the tower door to the corridor junction. 17 more to the study where Petra had told her, on the second day, the Duke typically worked until 2 in the morning during active political situations. Active political situation was Petra's phrase. Seraphine had filed it alongside the other evidence that the woman running Varellis' internal security had a gift for understatement that bordered on architectural. The guard outside the study door clocked her approach with the specific attentiveness of someone who had been briefed to expect unusual movement patterns from the East Tower. He didn't stop her. He did reach for the door handle before she could, which she read as courtesy dressed as protocol. She went in without knocking. Lucien was at the campaign table. Not the maps, the correspondence stack, which his aide organized each evening into 3 categories she had identified after 4 days of peripheral observation: actionable, monitoring, and a third category she privately labeled accelerants, meaning documents that required response before their contents found other recipients. He looked up when she entered with the particular quality of someone who had been expecting interruption and had simply been waiting to learn its shape. She put the note on the table in front of him. He read it without touching it, twice. Then he looked at her face, and whatever he found there confirmed something he'd apparently already begun calculating. When, he said, slipped under the door. Within the last 2 hours. She pulled the chair across the table from him and sat without being offered it, which on the first week would have been a small territorial test and now was simply the fastest configuration for the conversation they needed to have. The handwriting. I've seen it once before. Whose? Councilman Devereaux Hale. She watched him process the name, watched the precise moment it landed against whatever model he was running. He's been on the High Council for 4 years. Before that, provincial administration in the Eastern Territories. Before that, I know who Hale is. Then you know he's been considered politically moderate. Yes. He's not moderate, she said. He's patient. There's a difference. Lucien leaned back in his chair with the kind of deliberate stillness that she had come to recognize as his most genuine state. Not the performance of stillness that powerful men often used as a dominance tool, but the actual variety, the kind that came from a mind that had learned to slow external motion, so internal motion could run faster. He planned it, Lucien said. The regent gave the order. Hale gave the target, the timing, the route of exit, and, I believe, the cover story. She kept her voice level. It cost something. She had not expected to say this aloud to another living person tonight, possibly ever, and the words had a physical quality she hadn't anticipated. My family had enemies. Everyone with an empire has enemies, but someone had to turn those enemies into an event. Someone had to know which guard rotations to compromise, which servants to bribe, which fire to start and which corridor to make the chaos look accidental. Administration, Lucien said. It wasn't contemptuous. It was almost admiring, in the cold way he had of acknowledging competence regardless of its application. Administration, she agreed. He didn't get blood on his hands. He organized the conditions under which other people got blood on theirs. Lucian picked up the note then, holding it by its edge, studied the handwriting. He knows you're here, he said, which means he's known since at least the night of the ball. Before the ball, she had been running this since the tower window. The poison attempt. If Aldrich Fenburn organized it, Fenburn needed intelligence about my presence in this castle. Intelligence he shouldn't have had, because I had not yet been identified publicly, which means someone provided it to him. Before the commander arrived. Before the commander arrived. She held his gaze. Someone in this castle told Fenburn who I was before the Imperial Guard revealed it to anyone. The silence between them had a specific density now. Not the productive silence of thinking, but the pressurized silence of two people arriving at the same uncomfortable geography from different directions. Inside the walls, he said. Inside the walls. He set the note down. Short list, he said, and his voice had gone to the register she associated with decisions that had already been made. Access to your identity before the ball would require someone with knowledge of Imperial archive records, someone with a reason to monitor Imperial Guard movements, someone positioned to observe your presence in this household without triggering notice. Or, she said, someone who wasn't watching me at all, someone who was watching you and noticed something that didn't fit and drew a correct conclusion. He was quiet for a moment. My household, he said. Someone who understands your patterns well enough to notice a deviation. She kept her voice neutral. 14 months in your castle. No one asked me why I stayed when better positions were available in the south. No one except my steward. Flat, no inflection. He asked me twice, she said. Once in the 3rd month, once in the 10th. I gave him answers, good ones, but he was asking. Lucy Tien stood from the table. He moved to the window. The same window she'd seen him at in the library, with the closed book. The courtyard below was lit by the guard post torches, and she could see 2 of Petra's people on the perimeter walk, moving with the unhurried regularity that indicated nothing had yet broken the surface of the night. Renaud has been with this house for 19 years, he said to the window. She didn't respond. There was nothing useful to add to that, and she had learned that the most valuable thing she could offer this particular man in specific moments was the absence of premature conclusion. He has a son in the capital, Lucien said, in apprenticeship with one of the merchant guilds. She understood immediately. The understanding sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. Hail, she said. If the guild is Hale's, the Eastern Merchant Consortium, he chairs it privately through a proxy. I have documentation. She watched his profile, the jaw, the set of his shoulders, which she had learned to read like weather. If Renaud's son is apprenticed there, Hale has 19 years of your household's internal information and a mechanism that doesn't require Renaud to understand what he's participating in. Lucian turned from the window. His expression was not the one she expected. She had prepared for cold fury, the contained variety, the kind that expressed itself through precise action rather than temperature. What she got instead was something closer to exhaustion, and it lasted barely 2 seconds before it was replaced. But she saw it, and she cataloged it, and she filed it in the category she had labeled cautiously, things that make him human. You're certain, he said. I'm not certain of anything. I'm working with pattern and inference. But your estimate? 85%, she said. Renaud isn't a traitor. He's a father who answered questions from the wrong people because the wrong people had leverage on someone he loved. That's still the same outcome. Yes, she said. It is. He crossed to the door, opened it. The guard outside turned immediately. Find Petra, Lucian said. Now. The guard went. Lucian came back to the table but didn't sit. He stood with his hands flat on the campaign maps and looked at the configuration of roads and walls and approaches that he'd been managing for 22 days, and she watched him absorb the recalibration, the understanding that the perimeter he'd been defending was not only external. The note is a move, she said. He's not warning me. He's testing whether I'll run. If you run, you're exposed. If I stay, he wants me to panic and make a mistake. She looked at the note on the table between them. He's been patient for 12 years. He's very good at waiting for people to destroy themselves. Then we don't run and we don't panic, Lucian said. We also don't wait, she said. He looked at her. We find who in your castle is the channel and we close it, she said. Not Renaud himself, yeah. If we move on Renaud, Hale knows we've identified the line and he burns it and opens a new one somewhere we're not looking yet. We close it from the other end. We feed the channel something that produces a response we control. The particular quality of his attention sharpened. You want to use your own exposure, Bolt, he said. I want to use his certainty that he's smarter than whoever he's dealing with. Patient people who are very good at waiting tend to have one consistent weakness. They underestimate people who've been learning to wait longer than them. 5 years, she said, versus his 12. But I learned faster. Petra arrived in 4 minutes, which Seraphine noted was faster than any 4-minute response she'd observed in 22 days, and which told her that Petra had been awake and mobile and probably within the castle's interior rather than at any external post. Petra ran night watch, yes. But Petra had also, Seraphine had observed, been spending an unusual amount of time near the east corridor since the second week. She filed that too. Petra entered, assessed the room's configuration in approximately 1.5 seconds, looked at the note on the table without touching it, and looked at the Duke. East Tower was accessed, Lucien said. I know, Petra said. My corridor watch logged an unscheduled movement at the 11th hour. Household staff ID kitchen level. Who? Don't have a name yet. The watch logged the corridor pass token, not the face. Whoever it was knew which corners our visual coverage doesn't meet. Petra's gaze moved to Seraphine briefly. Not hostile, assessing. This has been planned. The access point has been mapped. Someone has been walking that route long enough to know its gaps. Renaud, Lucien said. Petra didn't react. This was, Seraphine thought, because Petra had already arrived at this destination independently and was simply waiting to confirm she was allowed to act on it. His morning schedule, Lucien said. Don't change it. Don't restrict it. His access to the household remains exactly what it's been. Petra absorbed this. You want the line left open. I want the line left open and watched. And the note, Petra said. Seraphine spoke before Lucien could. Renaud needs to believe the note produced the result Hale expected. We'll need to create the appearance of disruption, something Renaud will observe and report upward. Petra looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a category. What kind of disruption? Petra said. A departure, Seraphine said. Staged. Cart moving out through the western gate before dawn, imperial guards accompanying. Enough visibility that anyone watching the castle from an upper window sees movement that looks like evacuation. And you, Petra said, stay in the East Tower and don't appear in any common area for 36 hours, long enough for the report to travel and a response to come back. Petra looked at the Duke. Lucien nodded once. Petra left. The room was quiet. 36 hours, Lucien said. If the channel is what I think it is, Hale will respond within 24. He's been waiting 12 years. If he believes I've broken cover and run, he won't wait. And when he responds? His response will tell us whether he's acting alone or with the Regent's active coordination. She looked at the campaign maps, at the roads, at the distances between walls and armies, and the weight of what was already in motion. Because if the Regent knows I'm here, he's already positioned troops. But if Hale has been running this privately, if he's been managing my location without the Regent knowing the full picture, then we have a gap between them. And gaps are the only place this kind of war gets won. Lucien studied her face. You've been planning this for longer than 22 days, he said. I've been planning for the Hale contingency for 3 years, she said. I didn't know it would be here. I didn't know the specific configuration. But I knew that whoever planned the original event would eventually make contact if I surfaced. Patient men can't resist confirming their work. You surfaced deliberately. The word landed in the space between them. She had been waiting for him to reach this, and she had prepared for it. And she found now that the preparation had not entirely accounted for the specific quality of this man's intelligence, which processed implications not in sequence but simultaneously, which meant he had already run the thread backward from the present to the beginning and arrived at the Winter Dominion Ball, he said. Yes. You were here for 14 months. His voice was careful in a way that was more precise than careful. It was a voice choosing not to become something else. The Imperial Guard found you at my winter ball specifically. I sent them a message, she said, 3 weeks before the ball, with a location and a date. You orchestrated your own exposure. I chose the time and place. In my house. Your house was the safest configuration, she said. You are the most politically isolated of the Northern Lords who weren't already in Hale's network. Your history with the Crown Council is public and adversarial. Your military capability is sufficient to make immediate removal difficult. And your self-interest, she looked at him directly, is sophisticated enough that you wouldn't make the obvious short-term move. The silence that followed had a different quality from any of the previous ones. Not the productive silence, not the pressurized silence. Something tighter than both. The most politically useful man to surface next to, Lucien said. Yes. You walked into my household 14 months ago and assessed my usefulness. Yes. He didn't move. She had learned that his stillness scaled with the intensity of what was running underneath it, and the stillness right now was of a quality she hadn't encountered before. And she had a very precise sense of being in territory she'd mapped in theory, but had not tested against the actual terrain. The poison attempt, he said. You could have warned me before the ball. If I warned you before the ball, there was no public confirmation of my identity. The Imperial Guard needs a public event. The reveal needs witnesses. She held his gaze and didn't soften it. You weren't in danger. I knew the poison was in the goblet, and I knew exactly when to intercept it. You were never not going to survive that evening. You used my attempted assassination as a stage direction. I used a stage that someone else had already set, she said. I adjusted the blocking. Another silence. Longer. She had a feeling she associated, from years of negotiation in small rooms with people who had more immediate power than her, with the moment just before something irrevocable. And if I had been a different kind of man, he said, if I had surrendered you that first night, if I had made the obvious move, then I would have gone, she said, and approached the next name on my list, and the next, until I found the configuration that worked. She paused. But I've had 5 years to study the Northern Lords. You were always first. He moved then. Not toward her. Away, toward the window again. The same window. And she thought there was something in that pattern worth noting. That the window was where he went when he needed the outside world to anchor him, when the interior became, "You're telling me this now," he said to the glass, "not on the first night. On the first night I needed your decision to be based on what you actually wanted, not on the full complexity of the situation. And now you've already made the decision. Now you've locked the gates. Now," she stopped, chose the next words carefully. "Now I think you deserve to know that the person you've locked your gates for chose you deliberately, not because you were safe, because you were the right configuration of dangerous and capable and used," he said. "Aligned," she said. "There's a difference." He turned from the window. His expression was the most unguarded she'd seen it, which was not especially unguarded by most human standards, but which on his face represented a significant departure from baseline. She recognized the specific combination. Anger that had found no clean object to attach to, because the thing that had made him angry was also the thing he couldn't entirely object to, because he would have done the same. "My instinct right now," he said, "is to throw you out of this castle. I know. That instinct is not going to win. I know that too. What I don't know, he said, and his voice had gone to something quieter and more dangerous than the previous register, is whether I'm making a decision right now or whether I'm executing a decision you made for me 3 years ago." Seraphine looked at him. "Both," she said. "The same way every choice anyone makes is both what they decided and the sum of every condition that produced the moment of deciding. You can be angry about that if you need to, but it doesn't change what's outside your walls. And it doesn't change what you already know about whether working with me is the correct move. A long moment. The 36 hours, he said finally, starting now. He crossed to the table and picked up the note, looked at it one more time. Hale's response, he said. When it comes. I want to be in the room. I assumed you would be. He left. She sat at the campaign table for a long time in the empty study. The candles burned. The night outside the window was still and cold and full of the particular silence of a place that was holding its breath. She had told him the truth. She had not expected that to feel the way it felt. The stage departure happened at 4 a.m, and Seraphine watched it from the East Tower's single window with the particular flatness of a woman who had orchestrated it and was still making herself watch it anyway. Because watching the things you'd arranged was how you caught the things you'd miscalculated. Petra had done it well. 2 carts, imperial guard colors visible, movement deliberate enough to register against the dark, but not so theatrical as to read as performance. The western gate opened and closed in the space of 6 minutes. Anyone watching from the upper floors of the castle's interior would have seen exactly what they were meant to see. She waited. 22 hours later, Petra came to the tower. She brought a folded document and an expression that contained the specific flatness of a person who had seen what she'd seen and was processing it on the move. The channel confirmed, Petra said. Renault sent a message out through the kitchen delivery gate, disguised as a supplier return. She held the document out. We intercepted before it left the wall, copied it, returned the original. Seraphine unfolded it. Not Renault's writing. The writing was small and careful, and she recognized it. The particular hand of a man who signed documents with the practiced authority of someone who understood that a signature was never just a name. Hale had been communicating with Renault directly. The note was brief. Had she gone? Which route? Who went with her? Was the Duke isolated? Renault's reply, tucked underneath in simpler script, answered all 4 questions with the information Seraphine had been careful to make visible. Gone. Western Road, 6 guards. Duke remains. Northern defenses still standing. Then, at the bottom of Renault's note, in a different ink, slightly darker, as if written last and quickly, she left something, East Tower, unclear what. She seemed to be in a hurry. Seraphine read that last line 3 times. Renault had added that himself. Nothing in what she'd arranged had prompted it. He had added intelligence that he generated independently, which meant, she ran it fast, he was more deeply invested in the reporting than a man merely answering leverage questions would be. He was contributing. He believed he was useful, which meant Hale had given him something in return for that belief. The son, not just apprenticeship, something more immediate, something that had moved recently. Renault's son, she said. We're already looking, Petra said. What we need to know is whether he's been moved in the last month. Hale won't have activated this channel fully until he knew I was surfacing. If the sun has been repositioned, brought closer to the capital, or moved to a location Hale controls more directly. He's been moved, Petra said. Seraphine looked at her. We found it this morning. He was transferred 3 weeks ago to a guild property inside the capital's 2nd district, 4 blocks from the Crown Council building. Inside the pocket Hale had access to. Inside the radius where a man being cooperative could maintain the belief that his son was safe as long as he kept cooperating, and where the same man could be shown the alternative without the alternative ever being stated. Renault doesn't know his son is a hostage, Seraphine said. I don't think he knows anything except that he has access to information Hale finds useful and that his son has a very good position. He's going to find out. Seraphine folded the copied note carefully. Before we use this channel to feed Hale anything, Renault finds out. He deserves to know what he's been part of. Petra absorbed this. The Duke's going to want to manage Renault himself, she said. I know. He's going to want to use him. He probably should, Seraphine said, but not without the man understanding the full situation. That's the condition. The condition that nobody had asked her to impose and that she was imposing anyway, and she waited for Petra to push back because Petra was loyal to the castle first and the Duke second and Seraphine somewhere else on that list. And imposing conditions on the Duke's intelligence operations was, agreed, Petra said. Seraphine looked at her. You've been running an assessment, Seraphine said. Since the first week, Petra said without apology. And you're not what I expected, Petra said. That's sufficient. She left. Lucian came to the East Tower himself that evening with the copied correspondence and a specific quality of focus that told her he'd already processed the Renault situation and arrived at the same position she had without needing to be walked there. This was becoming a pattern she was choosing not to think about too directly. We tell him, Lucian said, first thing, before he'd crossed fully into the room. Yes. Tonight. Yes. He set the correspondence on the table and stood over it. In the tower's single lamp, his face had the configuration she associated with the calculations that cost him something. Not pain exactly, but the particular weight of a man who had learned to operate without sentiment and who found sentiment inserting itself into the machinery anyway and was constantly, quietly, furious about it. 19 years, he said. He served you well for 19 years, she said. He's being used against you by someone he doesn't understand he's serving. Doesn't change the outcome. No, she said, but it changes what he deserves in terms of what happens next. Lucian looked at her across the table. You do this constantly, he said. Do what? Find the person inside the problem. His voice had no inflection she could immediately read. The wine steward. Renault, the kitchen girl with the reading lessons. He paused. You notice people. I was one of them, she said. For 5 years. You notice what you are. He was quiet for a moment. The girl, he said. The reading lessons. You told Petra. I told Petra the loose stone in the scullery wall should be left as it is. Something shifted in the set of his jaw. Not a smile. Not anything she could name with a word that implied warmth, but something that lived in the same geographic region. The stone stays, he said. As it is. Thank you. He picked up the correspondence. We call Renault in the morning, before the household wakes. Private. He looked at her. You should be there. He'll be ashamed, she said. Having me there might... He should know who he's been protecting without knowing it, Lucian said. Not because it makes the conversation easier, because it's accurate. She looked at him. 5 years of calculating the angles of every interaction. 5 years of every person being a resource or a liability or a gap in someone else's defense. 5 years of the world being a set of variables to be managed rather than a collection of people doing their best inside systems that had been designed to exhaust them. She was finding, in this room, in this castle, in the specific radius of this man's company, that the model required more frequent revision than she'd anticipated. All right, she said. He left the correspondence with her and went. Renaud came undone quietly. That was the phrase that came to her afterward, trying to describe it. Not dramatically. No collapse, no visible breakdown, nothing that an observer would have categorized as crisis. Just the particular unraveling of a man who had organized his understanding of the last several months around a story that had just been replaced, piece by piece, with a different and significantly more terrible story. Lucien told him, directly, without staging it for effect, without the kind of deliberate pausing that lesser men use to extend another person's discomfort. He laid it out in sequence, the channel, the notes, the son's relocation, the nature of what Hale had been using him for. Renaud sat very still across the table in the small morning room off the kitchen wing. His hands on the table's surface didn't move. He was 63 years old, and he had the hands of a man who had spent his adult life doing detailed work, organizing, cataloging, managing the vast machinery of a great household, and those hands, flat and still on the table, looked to Seraphine like the hands of someone who had just discovered that the detailed work had been, at some level, someone else's project. My son, he said. Is being monitored, Lucien said. Not harmed. Hale needs him cooperative, not frightened. He doesn't know. No. Renaud looked at his hands. The questions, he said. I thought it was ordinary curiosity. He sent messages occasionally. I thought it was professional interest. He chairs a guild consortium, I thought. He stopped. A long pause in which he was clearly running something very painful backward. I told him about the new servant, the one who stayed when others left. I told him because I thought it was household gossip, the kind of thing you mention. You didn't know, Seraphine said. He looked at her. She had not spoken yet this morning. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has just been told something is a different shape than he believed it was, and who is still physically adjusting to the new dimensions. Your Highness, he said. She made herself not react to the title. It still had a physical quality she hadn't fully calibrated to. You didn't know what you were doing. The people who designed that didn't want you to know. That's the entire mechanism. I gave him information, Renault said. You gave him what felt like ordinary information. He gave you context that made it feel ordinary. The architecture is his, not yours. It ends the same, Renault said, and his voice had the flatness of a man who understood systems and was applying that understanding to himself without mercy. It doesn't have to, Lucien said. Renault looked at him. I need the channel open, Lucien said. I need Hale to believe he still has a source inside these walls. I need that source to feed him specific information at specific times over the next 2 weeks. He held Renault's gaze with the directness that she had come to understand was its own form of respect, the refusal to look away from what he was asking. I'm asking you to be part of that, with full knowledge of what you're doing and why. Your son's position in the capital becomes something we monitor and protect, rather than something Hale controls. Renault was quiet for a very long time. You're asking me to deceive the man who's been deceiving me, he said. Yes. A pause that lasted long enough that Seraphine counted her heartbeats in it. Tell me, Renault said, exactly what you need him to believe. They worked through the morning. She left Lucien and Renault in the small room with the correspondence and the maps and the specific shared focus of 2 men building a mechanism, and she went back to the East Tower, and she stood at the window, and she looked out at the northern walls of Castle Varellis against a sky the color of old iron. 2 weeks. That was what she'd given herself. 2 weeks to use the channel to create the conditions under which Hale would move, would expose himself, would commit to an action that could be documented and witnessed and used. 2 weeks before the Regent's military pressure on the northern approaches made the castle's current position untenable, and the variables became too numerous to control. 2 weeks to do what she had been building toward for 5 years. She was aware, in the cold air of the tower room, of something she had not entirely planned for. Something she was choosing to observe without acting on, the way you observed a structural shift in architecture before deciding whether it required response. She had been alone with this for 5 years. The specific weight of that aloneness had become load-bearing. She had organized herself around it. She had made it functional, made it into the particular clarity that came from having no one whose safety you had to factor into a calculation except your own. She had made it into a discipline. She was aware that the weight was changing. She did not know yet what it was changing into. Below, in the courtyard, the morning guard rotation was beginning. She could see Petra moving along the inner wall with 2 of her people, the 3 of them covering ground with the comfortable efficiency of a long-established team. She could see the kitchen smoke beginning from the back chimneys. She could see, far down the northern approach, the line of tree cover that marked the edge of Varellis territory, and beyond that, invisible at this distance but entirely present in the calculation, the roads that armies traveled. The door opened behind her. Lucien. He'd moved quietly, which was not usual for him. He was normally entirely unbothered by the noise his own presence made. She turned. He had a document in his hand, formal paper, Varellis seal. He set it on the table inside the tower door. What is this? She said. The terms, he said, in writing. As agreed on the first night, an arrangement between parties, not wardship or custody. He looked at her. You should have it documented. She crossed to the table and looked at it without picking it up. The language was precise and unembellished. She recognized his style in it, the same economy that characterized everything he did, every word earning its place or being removed. At the bottom, his signature, and below it, a space. You trust documentation, she said. I trust clarity, he said. Documentation is what clarity looks like when you want it to survive you. She picked up the pen that he'd left beside the document. 2 weeks, she said. And then we move on Hale. 2 weeks. After that, everything changes. It already has, he said. She signed her name. Not the name she'd been carrying for 5 years, the real one. The name that until the Winter Dominion Ball had belonged only to the dead. She set the pen down. They stood on opposite sides of the table in the East Tower room with the iron sky morning coming through the window. And she was aware, the way you were aware of weather changing, the way you were aware of the specific moment when a structure had shifted past the point where it could be returned to what it was, that she was not in the same configuration she had been on the 22nd night. Something had been added. She had no vocabulary for it that felt precise enough to use. Lucian picked up his copy of the document, folded it once, put it inside his coat. The Regent's advance units, he said. Petra's scouts logged them this morning. Eastern Approach Road. 2 days out. You should have led with that, she said. I had something to do first. He left. She stood at the window and watched the guard rotation below and did not let herself think about what he'd meant, because thinking about what he'd meant was a different kind of variable, and she was not yet ready to factor it into the calculation, because once she did, the calculation would change in ways she couldn't fully model, and she needed the next 2 weeks to be very clean and very controlled. The document sat on the table behind her with both their signatures. The Regent's advance units were 2 days out. Somewhere in the capital, Councilman Devereaux Hale was waiting for a report that would tell him his patient 12-year architecture was finally moving toward its intended conclusion. He was wrong about what was moving. He was wrong about what was concluding. And in 4 days, Seraphine was going to show him exactly how wrong, or she was going to lose everything for the second time in the same empire by the hands of the same patient man. She pressed her scarred hand against the cold glass of the tower window. There was no version of the next 2 weeks that didn't require her to walk directly into the thing she'd been running from. The difference was that this time she wasn't running alone. Whether that made it safer or more dangerous was a question she was choosing with every available discipline she possessed, not to answer yet. The Eastern Approach Road. 2 days. The walls would hold or they wouldn't. She turned from the window and began to work. The advance units arrived in 1 day instead of 2. Seraphine heard the horn signal from the East Tower at dawn. 3 short, 1 long, the Varellis perimeter alert sequence that Petra had drilled into every guard rotation since the first week. And she was already dressed, already at the table with the correspondence spread in front of her, already running the implications before the echo had died against the northern wall. 1 day early. That was not a miscalculation in Petra's scouts. Petra's people didn't miscalculate distances. 1 day early meant the advance units had moved through the night, which meant they were not behaving like advance units establishing a forward position before a main force arrived. They were behaving like a first strike, which meant Hale had not waited for her information to travel through Renault, which meant Hale had another channel she hadn't found. She was down the tower stairs and through the east corridor before the second horn had finished sounding. The war room was already populated when she arrived. Lucienne at the head of the campaign table, Petra on his left with a field report in hand, 3 of the senior military staff arranged along the near wall in the specific configuration of men who had been pulled from sleep into crisis and were performing competence with varying success. The imperial commander, whose name was Aldous, stood near the eastern window with his arms crossed in an expression that indicated he was making assessments and keeping them to himself until invited. Lucienne looked up when she entered. His jaw was set at the angle she associated with decisions already in progress. "Southeast approach," he said before she could speak. "Not the eastern road." They came through the Fenbrook lowlands. She crossed to the table, found Fenbrook on the map, traced the lowland route with 1 finger. "That route is impassable this time of year," she said. "Apparently not. It's been impassable for 2 seasons. The Ashwick survey—" She stopped. The Ashwick survey. The one she had mislabeled and replaced, and which had contained specifically the notation about the western passage near Fenbrook being impassable. She had told Lucian about that survey on the night she'd told him everything else. In the library, at 2 a.m. "Someone told them about the survey's inaccuracy," she said. The room was quiet. "The lowland route isn't in any current military manifest," Petra said. The only documentation of its actual condition is in the corrected survey, the one that I described the location of, Seraphine said. In this castle, in a room that was not surveilled. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The people in this room were capable of completing it themselves, and the specific silence that followed was the silence of people completing it and arriving at the conclusion and looking, as a group, at the thing the conclusion pointed toward, not Renault. Renault's channel was to Hale. Hale had been told she was gone. Hale had received that information and had not redirected the advance units, or had received it too late, or had another source that superseded it, or... Lucian's voice was entirely flat. Who was in the library? You, she said, and I. That night, the household. The guard outside your corridor, the perimeter watch, which rotated at midnight, and... She ran it. The castle's interior movement on that specific night, 3 weeks ago. She had catalogued it because she catalogued everything, and the habit now produced from that filing a single piece of information she had noted and set aside as irrelevant. The aide, she said, your correspondence aide. He was in the adjacent room until what hour? Lucien looked at Petra. Petra's expression shifted by a degree that, on her face, represented significant alarm. He filed the late correspondence. He would have been in the adjacent study until at least 1 in the morning. The wall between the library and the adjacent study, Seraphine said. Stone, Petra said, a foot thick. But the ventilation passage, Lucien said, and his voice had gone to somewhere below flat, somewhere that had no temperature at all. Petra was already moving toward the door. Don't take him yet, Seraphine said. Petra stopped. If we take him now, Hale knows we've found the second channel. He redirects. He has enough from us already to adjust his approach. He knows the castle's layout. He knows the survey's actual content. He knows that his advance units are in position. What he doesn't know is what we know. She looked at Lucien. We need one more piece from him first. What piece? Lucien said. The main force, she said, where the regent's primary army is staging. The advance units in the lowlands are a pressure tactic. They're not enough to take these walls. They're enough to make us respond, to make us show our defensive configuration, to give the main force information about where to concentrate when it arrives. She looked at the map, at the distances. If we can get that staging location before we close the second channel, we change the shape of the next week entirely. Lucien looked at the map. She watched him process it, the clean, rapid quality of a mind-running military geometry. We feed him something, Lucien said. Something that requires him to confirm the staging location in his response. If he confirms it to the aide, we have it. A pause. 3 seconds. 4. Do it, Lucien said. She turned to the correspondence staff at the near wall. I need a document. Military assessment format, Varellis seal, dated this morning. It should indicate uncertainty about the regent's primary staging position and request confirmation of northern approach routes. She looked at Lucien. From you, your voice, your phrasing. You're using me as the bait, he said. Your uncertainty is more credible than mine, she said. Hale has studied you for years. He knows what your genuine assessments look like. Something moved across his face that she catalogued and did not examine. He crossed to the table and picked up a pen, and she watched him write a document in his own hand with the specific quality of a man who was performing a version of himself that was almost but not entirely accurate. And the almost was the part she had designed, and she thought that there was something uncomfortable about watching someone be very good at performing a controlled version of their own vulnerability. She understood it because she had spent 5 years doing the same thing. He handed the document to the correspondence aide personally, with instructions to process it through the standard morning filing. Nothing flagged, nothing unusual. She watched the aide take it. He was young, 23, perhaps 24. He had a careful face, the kind that processed information with visible effort, the way people looked when they were simultaneously receiving data and deciding what to do with it. He had been in Lucien's service for 2 years, and she had noted him as thorough and reliable. And she had not noted him as anything else because she had been looking for the wrong profile. She had been looking for someone with motive. She had not accounted adequately for someone with fear. He took the document and left the room. They waited. Waiting was, she had long since concluded, the most technically demanding component of any operation involving human decision-making. Waiting required you to maintain the surface of a normal situation while the interior of the situation was running at full capacity, and the gap between those two things was where mistakes were made. She had watched experienced operators collapse in the waiting phase because the discipline required to hold the surface steady while the interior screamed was not a discipline you could develop quickly. It had to be worn in. She had 4 hours of administrative work she would have done anyway. She did it. Lucien ran his morning command briefing with the senior staff as if the advance units in the Fenbrook lowlands were a tactical inconvenience rather than the surface manifestation of a 12-year plan designed to end with her dead. She watched him do it from the back of the room and felt, not for the first time, the particular quality of respect that arrived without warning and refused to be filed neatly. Petra's people had the aid under passive surveillance by the second hour. The confirmation came in the third. Not a written document, smarter than that. A verbal exchange, overheard through a method Petra declined to specify, between the aide and a kitchen-level contact who had apparently been in place longer than any of them had known to look for. A location, a name, a number. The Regent's primary force was staging at Caldenmore, 60 miles south, 3 days at standard march. Seraphine received this information in the East Tower from Petra directly and sat with it for 45 seconds while she ran the military implications, the logistical implications, the channel closing sequence, and the revised timeline in parallel. Then she went to find Lucien. He was in the armory, not inspecting it, working in it. He had a blade on the grinding wheel and was running it with the focused physicality of someone who needed to be doing something with his hands while his mind ran elsewhere. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched the sparks, and thought that there was something in this man's relationship to craft, to the actual physical making and maintaining of things, that was not decorative. It was structural. It was how he stayed functional under sustained pressure. She had noted it. She had not yet decided what to do with what she'd noted. "Caldenmore," she said. He released the wheel. The sparks died. 3 days, she said. "If they march standard." "They won't march standard." He set the blade down and turned. "They'll push. 2 days, maybe less. The advance units are designed to keep us managing the southern perimeter while the main force closes the distance. We need to close the channel before they arrive. The aid and the kitchen contact, both. Now." She held his gaze. "And we need to move. We can't sit in these walls for 2 days while a main force closes Caldenmore distance. We need to be somewhere else." "Running," he said. "Repositioning," she said. "There's a difference. Running is what they want. If we break from the castle, they expose us in open territory. But if we move toward them instead of away, we choose the ground." "There's a place," she said, 14 miles northeast, Ashwick Crossing. The terrain there." "I know Ashwick." "Then you know that a force defending that crossing with sufficient northern cavalry could hold a position twice its size for 3 days. "Long enough," he said. "For what?" She looked at him. This was the part she had not said yet, the part she had been carrying since the night in the library, since the document signing in the East Tower, since the moment she had begun understanding that the shape of what she'd planned 5 years ago was not entirely the shape of what was now possible. "Long enough for me to get to the capital," she said. Silence. "While you hold Ashwick," she said, "while the Regent's attention is on this army and this territory and the political noise of the North declaring military sovereignty, I move south, into the capital, to Hale directly." "Alone," he said, "with Aldous and 6 of the Imperial Guard, civilian clothing, routes that bypassed the main roads." She had been designing this for 3 days, since the moment she'd fully understood that Caldenmore was the staging location. "Hale is in the capital. If I can reach him before the Regent's force reaches Ashwick, before the military pressure produces the kind of emergency response that locks down every entrance in the city, I can get to the evidence." "What evidence?" "His correspondence archive. 12 years of it. The Regent knows Hale planned the massacre, but the Regent also knows that Hale's archive is the thing that implicates them both. As long as that archive exists, they have mutual leverage. If I can get to it, you take their leverage from each other, Lucian said, and put it in your hands. In front of the High Council, she said, in front of every lord who's been waiting to see which way this falls. The archive is the difference between a claim and a case. He looked at her for a long time. You walk into the capital, he said, while the Regent's army is moving north, while every imperial checkpoint is activated, while Hale is specifically looking for you. Hale thinks I've run, she said. Renault's channel told him I left. The aide's channel confirmed I left. He's managing what he believes is a leaderless political situation, a duke with military sovereignty and no imperial heir to give it legitimacy. He's not looking for me to walk toward him. He'll look when you get close. I'll get close fast. Lucian picked up the blade he'd been grinding and looked at it. Not her. The blade. If you don't make it, he said, to Hale's archive, if something goes wrong between here and the capital, then you fight a siege, and the outcome is what the outcome is. That's not what I was asking. She understood then what he was asking. The particular quality of the silence around the words was explicit enough. She was not prepared for it. She had prepared for a great many things in the last 3 weeks, and she was not prepared for this, and she stood in the armory doorway with the smell of hot metal in the air and the weight of 2 days pressing down on everything, and found that her model did not have an adequate response. Lucienne, she said. The name, not the title. She had not said it before. He looked up from the blade. I'll make it, she said. It was not the response the question had warranted, and they both knew it. He set the blade down. Close the channels, he said. We move at nightfall. The aide's name was Corvin, and he came undone differently from Renault. Renault had come apart quietly. Corvin came apart with the specific desperation of someone very young who had made a catastrophic decision for a reason they had convinced themselves was temporary and had watched it become permanent, and who now sat across a table from the Duke of Varellis and understood, fully and physically, that the distance between temporary and permanent was the distance he had just run out of. Lucien did not raise his voice once. This was, Seraphine observed from the room's edge, the most frightening version of him. The raised voice was an emotion performing itself. You could respond to an emotion. You could find the edges of it and work around them. The version of Lucien that sat across from Corvin and dismantled every constructed defense with the flat, clinical efficiency of someone removing stones from a wall was not performing anything. The kitchen contact, Lucien said. How long? 14 months, Corvin said. His voice had the texture of something that had been through too much in too short a time. She was already here when I arrived. She told me she worked for a merchant consortium, that the information was for trade assessment purposes. I didn't... What did you give them first? Lucien said. A pause. Correspondence schedules, Corvin said. When documents were processed. Standard administrative timing. He looked at his hands. It seemed harmless. The kind of thing that wouldn't... When did you understand it wasn't harmless? The longest pause yet. The survey, Corvin said. The library conversation. Yes. And you reported it anyway. She told me, Corvin said, and his voice cracked on the second word, and he spent a second rebuilding it, that if I stopped, that there were people who had my family's location in the Eastern District, that if I stopped cooperating, those people would receive instruction. Seraphine felt the architecture of it settle into place with the grim clarity of something she had suspected without fully articulating. Hale's network didn't run on ideology. It ran on the same leverage it had used on Renault, on the specific vulnerability of people who had someone they loved more than they feared the consequences of bad decisions. 2 channels. 2 different families. 1 design. The kitchen contact's name, Lucien said. Maris, Corvin said. She told me her name was Maris. I don't know if that's... Petra was already gone. Corvin looked at the table. He was very young, and he had understood in the space of the last half hour exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost, and the understanding sat on him like something physical. My family, he said. Petra will have people with them before the hour is out, Lucien said. Eastern District Safe House. They'll be moved. Corvin looked up, something in his face that was too raw to be named simply. Why? He said. Lucien said nothing. He stood from the table and looked at the young man for a moment with an expression that Seraphine could not categorize and did not try to, and then he left the room. She stayed. Because, she said, you're not the weapon. You're the ammunition. She looked at Corvin's ruined face. The people who built what you got caught in, they specialize in finding people who have a reason to cooperate and giving them a reason that feels temporary. The temporary is the mechanism. It makes you make the first decision, and the first decision makes the second one feel inevitable. And by the time you understand the shape of it, you're load-bearing. You're not responsible for being targeted. You're responsible for what you did. She held his gaze. Those aren't the same thing, but they're both real. He was quiet for a long time. What happens to me? He said. That's the Duke's decision, not mine. What would you decide? She thought about it honestly. I'd keep you close, she said. People who've been inside a network know its texture in a way that no external analysis replicates. You know how Maris communicated, what she asked for, what she avoided. That's information. She paused. And you have a reason now to be very invested in the outcome. He looked at her. You're the one they wanted, he said. Not accusatory, just arriving at it. Yes. I helped them try to... Yes. A silence that had a particular quality. The silence of someone deciding whether to carry something or set it down. Tell me, he said, what I can do. She told him. Maris was not in the kitchen. This was the first thing that told Seraphine the calculation had shifted. Petra confirmed it within the hour. The woman had left the castle through the service entrance at some point in the previous 2 hours, which placed her departure in the window between the arrival of the advance unit horn and the current moment, which meant she had not left because she'd been discovered. She had left because she'd received a signal. Something had told her to move. The kitchen contact was not the end of the channel. The kitchen contact was a relay, and the relay had been activated by someone further up the line who had information Seraphine had not accounted for. She stood in the castle's main corridor and ran the chain backward. Renaud's channel to Hale. Corvin's channel through Maris to whoever Maris reported to. 2 channels operating in parallel, which she had identified and which she had been managing. But parallel channels with a common point of activation, a common signal source that could tell both chains simultaneously to close, meant there was a node above both of them. A node inside the castle walls that she had not found. Above Renaud. Above Maris. Someone who could see both channels and who had just burned both of them simultaneously, which meant the thought arrived with the particular physical sensation of a floor dropping away. Simultaneous channel closure was not a defensive action. It was not a security measure. It was an offensive move. You burned your own intelligence assets when you no longer needed them, when you had what you came for, when the operation had moved past the intelligence phase into the... Petra, she said. Petra was 3 feet away. Lock the eastern gate, Seraphine said. Right now. The postern door on the north wall, the service corridor access from the kitchen wing. The sound that came from the castle's southern approach was not a horn. It was cannon. The first impact hit the southern wall, and the castle shook in the way that very old stone shook. Not collapsing, not even close to collapsing, but transmitting the force of what had struck it through every room and corridor and stairwell in a deep, full-body vibration that reset every thought you'd been having. The advance units in the Fenbrook lowlands were not a pressure tactic. They were not a distraction. They were carrying artillery. Seraphine moved before the second impact, because the second impact would come in approximately 40 seconds, and she needed to be somewhere specific before it did, and the specific somewhere was the war room, where the campaign maps lived, because the campaign maps were the only thing she had that could tell her where the castle's fire coverage had gaps. And the gaps were what the advance units would target with the 3rd and 4th cannon rounds, while the noise and structural shock of the first 2 kept every defensive response operating 3 seconds behind. She ran. The castle staff were in motion around her. The specific controlled chaos of a household that had drilled for this scenario without expecting to execute it tonight, without expecting it from the southern approach, without expecting cannon. She moved through them with the automatic adjustments of someone who had learned very early how to navigate a panicking space without becoming part of the panic. Second impact. South wall, farther east than the first. She felt it through the floor and counted the seconds. 43. Lucien was already in the war room. He was at the map, and he was doing exactly what she'd been running toward. Tracing the southern wall coverage, finding the gaps, running the geometry of where the third round would land if the artillery commander was competent. He looked up when she came in. His eyes asked the question. "Third channel," she said. Someone above Renaud and Maris. They burned both assets simultaneously and opened the artillery 5 minutes later. "Inside the walls," he said. "Has to be. The timing is too precise. Whoever it is, they've been managing both channels from inside this castle." "And you don't know who?" "No." The word cost her something. She felt the precise weight of it. 5 years of discipline, 5 years of building every contingency, 5 years of being the person in the room who had already thought of the thing everyone else hadn't. And here, now in this room, with cannon rounding on the southern wall, she did not know. Third impact. The east section of the south wall. She had been right about the geometry. Cold comfort. "The castle can take 6 hours of this artillery," Lucien said. "Maybe 8 if they're moving it rather than fixed position. The advance units don't have the manpower to storm the walls even if they breach," she said. "They're not trying to take the castle. They're trying to hold us in place while—" Caldenmore. 2 days' march. Standard pace. But Lucien had said they wouldn't march standard. He had said they'd push. She went cold. "They're already moving," she said. "The main force. It's not 2 days out. The staging at Caldenmore was a misdirection. They've already moved." Lucien looked at her. "Corvin's information," he said. "We fed him a question about staging location. He passed it through Maris. But if Maris's controller already knew we'd identified the channel, if the close order went out before our question was answered, the response that came back was not Hale confirming the real location. The response was designed to confirm what they wanted us to believe. Caldenmore was never the staging location," she said. "We were given Caldenmore to make us think we had a window we don't have." Lucien looked at the map. She looked at it with him, at the roads, at the distances, at the positioning of the advance units that were not advance units but an artillery containment team, at Castle Varellis and its southern wall and the 6 to 8 hours it could absorb before the structural damage affected defensive integrity, at Ashwick, 14 miles northeast, and the plan she had built in her head for 3 days, at the route to the capital that would have taken her south while Lucien held the crossing. All of it restructured in the space of 60 seconds into a shape she hadn't planned for. "How long?" she said. "If they're already in march. If they pushed hard from wherever they actually staged." He worked the map. She watched his hands move across it. Not tentative, not hesitant. The hands of a man who had been reading military geography since he was old enough to be taught and who found in it the same language that other men found in text. 6 hours, he said. Maybe 7. The same window as the artillery. They coordinated it, she said. The artillery was timed with the march. Hold us in place for the 6 hours it takes the main force to close. Then the breach and the army arrive simultaneously. Yes. She looked at the castle walls. She thought about 6 hours. The plan doesn't work, she said. Ashwick Crossing, the capital, none of it. Not with the main force 6 hours out. We can't hold a crossing while I travel south because the crossing won't need to be held for 2 days. It'll need to be held for 6 hours against whatever they have. I know, he said. Which means, we don't hold, he said. We don't stay in these walls. We don't go to Ashwick. She looked at him. He was already rolling the campaign map, already making the decision that she could see he'd made while she was still completing the sentence, because he processed faster in the specific language of military geography than she did, and this was the language they were in now. The North Gate, he said. We go out the North Gate with everyone we can move in the next 30 minutes. The advance units are on the southern approach. The northern road is open. They'll see us move, she said. The advance units, yes. They'll see us move and they'll report it, and the main force will receive that information and adjust. We'll have maybe 4 hours before they cut off the northern road. 4 hours to go where? He put the map in her hands. She looked at it. Trace north. Followed the road. The answer was on the map. It had been on the map. She had looked at this map 20 times in the last 3 weeks, and she had not seen it because she had been looking for a defensive position, and what the map contained instead was the Ashwick Pass, she said. Not the crossing, the pass itself. The high ground. It's a 2-hour march in normal conditions. We won't be marching normal conditions. No. She looked at the pass on the map, at its elevation, at the specific topography of the approach, the narrow defile, the single viable road through, the high walls of the natural canyon on both sides. How many men do you have that can move fast? She said. 300, maybe 350. And the regent's main force. He was quiet for a moment. Estimates from the original intelligence put it at 2,000. If they pushed from a closer staging position, he paused. Could be more. She processed that arithmetic. 350 versus 2,000, minimum, in an elevated pass with favorable terrain. 6 to 7 times the disadvantage. She had spent 5 years studying military history because military history was the language in which power was most honestly expressed, and what military history told her about passes was that terrain could compensate for numbers up to a point, and that point was negotiable depending on the quality of the force defending it, and that the quality of the force defending it was directly related to whether the person leading it had ever looked at impossible odds and made them cost more than they were worth. She looked at Lucien. He was looking at the map, not at her, but the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of stillness around him said that he had already done this arithmetic and had already reached the same geographic conclusion and was waiting to see if she reached it from the same direction. The pass buys time, she said. Not victory. Time. Time for what? Time for me to get to the capital while your 350 make 2,000 bleed for every inch of that defile. His eyes came up from the map. You said the route south was cut. The main northern road is cut, she said. But if I go east from the pass, there's a river route. It adds 4 hours, but it bypasses every military checkpoint because it's not on any current tactical map. How do you know about a river route that's not on any tactical map? She held his gaze. Third shelf from the left in your Western archives, she said. Behind the tax records. There were 2 mislabeled surveys. Something crossed his face. Not the fractional movement she'd cataloged in the early weeks. Something fuller than that. Something that arrived without permission and stayed for longer than he probably intended. You planned for this, he said. I planned for needing to move without using the primary roads, she said. I didn't plan for the specific configuration, but the exit was always there. He was quiet. Outside, the 4th cannon impact rolled through the stone. 350 men, he said, in a pass, against a main imperial force. Yes, those are bad odds. Ashwick Pass from elevation, with the defile. It's the most defensible ground within 4 hours of this castle. You know that. I know that. She put the map on the table between them. It's not good odds, it's the least bad option remaining. And you walk into the capital alone, with Aldous and 6 guards, while I hold a mountain pass against 2,000 soldiers. Yes. A long silence. 4th impact. 5th. The south wall was taking punishment now with a regular rhythm that the castle's stone was absorbing stoically, the way very old things absorbed punishment, not without damage, but without immediate failure. The archive, Lucian said. If I get to Hale's archive. If. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. Not anger, something adjacent to anger, something that lived just underneath it and had more mass. If I get to it, she said, and bring it out with the right witnesses, lords who've been sitting on the fence, imperial administrators who've been operating under the regent's authority and would rather not continue to do so once a better option is visible, then what you're holding in Ashwick Pass doesn't need to be held forever. It needs to be held long enough for the ground to shift in the capital. How long? She did the arithmetic. 3 days, she said, at absolute minimum. More likely 4. 350 men, a mountain defile, 2,000, 4 days. She watched him understand what she was asking. She watched him understand it fully and completely, and without the softening that people sometimes allowed themselves when the request was enormous. And she watched him sit with the full weight of it, and she watched him not look away from it. "The pass holds," he said finally. "Lucien." "The pass holds," he said. 4 days, whatever it takes. He looked at her directly. "That's not negotiable. Go to your river route. Get to the archive. Do what you've spent 5 years building toward." She looked at him. There was something she needed to say. She had the vocabulary for it somewhere. She had spent 5 years building vocabulary for every contingency, every exit, every argument, every negotiation. She had words for this. She was certain she had words for this. They were unavailable to her right now. "The third channel," she said. "Whoever it is. They're still inside these walls." "I know. They'll know when we move. They'll signal." "Let them signal," he said. "I'd rather they signal my route than yours." She understood. If the third channel reported north movement toward Ashwick Pass, the Regent's force would orient toward Ashwick, away from the eastern route, away from the river, away from her. He was using his own vulnerability to cover her exit. She picked up the campaign map. "I'm going to get the archive," she said. "I know." "And after," he said, "is after. Go." She went. The north gate opened 31 minutes later with 352 men behind the Duke of Varellis and his black-armored military staff. She watched them go from the castle's upper parapet before she descended to the eastern postern with Aldous and 6 imperial guards in civilian clothing, carrying nothing that identified them and everything she needed. The 6th cannon round struck the south wall as she walked through the postern door. She did not look back. She had learned, very young, in a burning corridor with blood on her shoes, that looking back was the thing that cost you the seconds you needed to survive. She walked east, into the dark, toward the river. Behind her, somewhere in the castle she was leaving, a third channel she had not found was composing a message for a man who had spent 12 years waiting for this moment. Somewhere ahead of her, in a capital she hadn't seen in 5 years, that same man was sitting on evidence that could burn his world to its foundation. Between them, in a mountain pass 2 hours north, 350 men were about to learn whether the ground they were standing on was worth the price it was going to cost. She pressed her scarred hand flat against her side, felt her own heartbeat, and walked faster. The river was black and fast and cold enough to make breathing a conscious decision. Seraphine moved along its eastern bank with Aldous 3 paces ahead and the 6 guards distributed in the formation he'd arranged without being asked. 2 forward, 2 rear, 2 flanking at intervals that gave them visibility without clustering into a target. She had noted, in the first hour of travel, that Aldous ran his unit the way Petra ran castle security, on the assumption that the situation was already worse than reported, and that preparation for the worse version cost less than being wrong about the better one. She had spent the first 2 hours running the capital's layout in her head. Not the public layout, the ceremonial avenues, the council buildings, the market square she had last seen at age 7 from a moving carriage with her face pressed against cold glass. That layout was a performance. What she needed was the infrastructure underneath it, the service corridors, the delivery routes, the archival buildings that didn't appear on the official city maps because the official city maps were designed to show what the Empire wanted you to see. She had been building this secondary map for 3 years from tax records, supply manifests, and the occasional document that servants in the household she'd worked in had handled without reading, because servants handled documents they weren't expected to read. The accumulation of that secondary map lived in her memory with the same fidelity she'd applied to everything that mattered, because memory, unlike documentation, couldn't be seized at a gate checkpoint. Hale's private archive was not in his council offices. She was certain of this. Men who kept operational records of their own crimes did not keep them where colleagues could access them, and Hale had spent 12 years being the kind of patient that implied he understood, at a bone-deep level, the value of things being kept in the right places. The right place, for a man who had been administering Eastern provincial assets for the first decade of his career, was a property that predated his council appointment, something acquired quietly, maintained minimally, registered under a name adjacent enough to his own to require specific knowledge to connect. She had the name. She had the address. She had the street-level approach from 2 directions. What she did not have was a guarantee that the archive was there, that it was intact, that Hale hadn't moved it in the last month when the situation began developing, or that the property wasn't currently guarded by men who had been briefed to watch for a woman traveling east with imperial soldiers in civilian clothing. She ran the probability on that last item and arrived at a number she chose not to examine closely. "River bends east in approximately a mile," Aldous said from 3 paces ahead, without breaking stride or turning his head. "After that, we're within 2 hours of the city's outer district. How are the men?" "Ready." She believed him. She had watched these 6 for 3 weeks in the castle, and they had the specific quality of soldiers who had been selected for an assignment rather than assigned to one. Men who understood what they were doing and had reasons for it that went beyond orders, which was the only kind of unit she would trust for this. "After the outer district," she said, "we separate. You take 4 men and hold the eastern approach to the Saren Street property. I go in with 2. The archive access. There's a service entrance on the property's north face. The lock mechanism is a type I know." She had spent an afternoon in the second year of her service life learning lock mechanisms from a locksmith's handbook she'd found in an estate library, because lock mechanisms were the kind of knowledge that had no obvious value until it had the only value that mattered. "I'll need 20 minutes inside. And if you need more than 20, then I'll need you to make the eastern approach very loud for however long it takes." Aldous was quiet for a moment. "Understood," he said. She kept walking. The river moved beside her, fast and cold and indifferent, and she thought about Lucian moving toward Ashwick Pass with 350 men and the particular configuration of the terrain she had studied on a campaign map 2 hours ago, and she thought about 350 against 2,000 in a mountain defile, and she thought about 4 days, and she made herself stop thinking about it because the thinking was not useful, and the not thinking was survival. And she had been choosing survival since she was 7 years old, and she was not going to stop now. She pressed her hand against the dark fabric of her traveling coat and felt the folded document inside, the copy of Hale's handwritten note, the one with 8 words, which she was carrying because it was physical evidence with his handwriting on it. And physical evidence was the kind of thing you kept on your person when the alternative was losing it. She walked faster. At the Ashwick Pass, Lucien was learning the specific arithmetic of elevation. He had known it theoretically, had studied it, had applied it in the 2 prior campaigns that constituted his military record, had understood from textbook and practice that high ground multiplied the effective capacity of a smaller force in ways that flat terrain never could. He had known this the way a man knew the weight of an object before picking it up. Picking it up was different. The pass was a natural defile, cut through the Ashwick ridgeline over centuries of water and weather. A canyon perhaps 30 yards across at its narrowest point, with walls that rose 40 feet on both sides, and which were, critically, climbable from the interior and nearly vertical from the exterior. A force moving through the defile from the south had 3 options: compress into the narrow point and absorb whatever was dropped on them from above, spread along the canyon floor and lose formation integrity, or stop. Lucien had 352 men positioned across 3 defensive lines, the front 2 in the defile itself, and the 3rd on the elevated ridge with every piece of ranged capacity they'd brought out of the castle in 31 minutes. It was, by any honest assessment, insufficient. He knew this. He had known it before the first horn sounded below, before the lead elements of the Regent's main force appeared on the southern approach road and resolved from the pre-dawn dark into the specific configuration of a well-organized, well-supplied, professionally commanded military force that substantially exceeded 2,000 men. The 3rd channel had fed them information he hadn't given it. The Regent's commanders knew the pass was occupied. They had adjusted their formation accordingly. The advance spread. The artillery repositioned to loft rounds over the defile's edge, rather than against it directly. The cavalry holding back because cavalry in a 30-yard canyon was not cavalry. It was a killing floor. They knew what they were walking into. They were walking into it anyway, because 2,000 versus 350 meant that the arithmetic favored patience, and patience in this specific geography meant grinding down the defensive force over 4 days until the advantage of terrain could no longer compensate for the advantage of numbers. Lucien stood at the ridge edge in the gray pre-dawn and watched the formation below develop, and he ran the math the way he ran all math, cleanly, without the self-protective rounding that turned bad numbers into acceptable ones. And he arrived at the same answer he'd arrived at before they left the castle. This was survivable for 4 days only if the men holding it believed it was survivable. And men believed things were survivable primarily because of the person standing at the point of maximum exposure. "They're going to probe the defile first," said Captain Rennis, his senior field commander from 2 feet to his left. Rennis had been running northern military operations for 8 years and had the specific quality of a man who processed combat information without the emotional freight that slowed decision-making. "Test our coverage. Look for gaps." "Let them find the gaps," Lucian said. Rennis looked at him. "We have 3 gaps in the ridge coverage," Lucian said. "Eastern wall 40 feet north of the defile mouth, western wall 20 feet north, and the secondary approach trail behind the ridgeline." He looked at the formation below. "Let them find all 3. If they find the gaps, they'll commit forces to exploit them, forces that aren't in the main defile push." He looked at Rennis. "A gap that costs them 100 men to move through is not a gap. It's a trap that looks like a gap." Rennis absorbed this. "The eastern wall gap is real," Rennis said. "We don't have enough people to cover it and hold the defile simultaneously." "I know." "If they push through the eastern wall, they will push through the eastern wall," Lucian said, "in the 3rd or 4th hour, when they've confirmed it's undermanned." He looked at the terrain. When they push, the eastern wall unit falls back to the secondary position. Not routes, falls back. Controlled. Pulling the pursuit into the secondary canyon. "The secondary canyon dead ends." "Yes." Rennis was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to let them trap themselves," he said. "I'm going to let them believe they're trapping us," Lucian said. "There's a difference." The distinction was in fact everything. The terrain of the Ashwick Pass was not simply a defile. It was a connected system of 3 natural features that a force moving fast through unfamiliar ground would read in sequence: the primary defile, the eastern wall access, and the secondary canyon that appeared to be a defensible fallback position, but was in reality an enclosed space with 1 entry point and 40-foot walls that had no exits. A pursuing force that committed to the secondary canyon in the belief that they were pressing a retreating defender would find themselves enclosed in those 40-foot walls with 1 entry point behind them, which was where Lucian planned to have his 3rd defensive line waiting on the ridgeline above. It was not going to make the arithmetic even. Nothing was going to make the arithmetic even. But it was going to make the arithmetic cost more than the Regent's commander was planning for, and cost and time were the only 2 variables he had to work with, and he was going to extract every unit of both. The horn below sounded. The first probe began. Lucian moved to the defile. He was, his military staff would note later in the after-action accounts that some of them would eventually write, not where a duke belonged in combat. A duke belonged in the command position, elevated, with full visibility of the engagement and the capacity to redirect forces as information changed. A duke did not belong in a 30-yard canyon with the 1st defensive line, which was where Castle Varellis went as the probe force entered the defile mouth, because he had understood before the first blow landed that the arithmetic of this situation was not going to be solved by command decisions. It was going to be solved by the specific mathematics of what men were willing to do when the person asking them to do it was in the same 30 yards of ground doing it alongside them. He had spent his adult life ruling through the reputation of what he was capable of. The North feared House Varellis because they had never had cause to doubt what the Duke would do when challenged. That reputation was useful in peacetime and in political negotiation and in the specific theater of intimidation that governed most high-level power dynamics. In a 30-yard canyon against 6 times your number, reputation was nothing. What mattered was the thing underneath the reputation, the actual capacity it had been built on. The probe force came in fast and organized, 40 men in tight formation, and the front defensive line held for the 30 seconds it took to establish that the defile was genuinely manned before the probe pulled back and the real push began. The real push was 200 men. Lucian had 60 in the front line. The next 3 hours were the most brutal arithmetic of his life. He fought in the defile with the specific economy of someone who had been trained to conserve exactly the energy required for each threat and no more. No waste, no performance, nothing that wasn't functional. Around him, the 60 men of the front line did what 60 men could do against the pressure of 200 in confined terrain. They made it expensive. Every inch of ground cost something. Every yard the probe force gained cost them a man or time, or both. And time and men were the two things the Regent's commander couldn't regenerate in the past the way he could at the base of the hill with 2,000 in reserve. The front line took casualties. Lucien took a blade across the left forearm in the second hour. A clean cut, not deep, painful in the immediate and ignorable for the duration, which was all it needed to be. He registered it and continued. Around him, the men of the front line registered that the Duke had taken a hit and was still in the defile. And something happened in the chemistry of the unit, something that had no name in any tactical manual he'd read, but which he recognized from both sides of it. The thing that happened when the person with the most to lose decided that the ground they were standing on was worth the price. It made men different. It didn't make them invincible. It didn't close the arithmetic gap. But it changed the quality of the resistance in a way that the Regent's commanders, watching from the south approach road with their 2,000 and their artillery and their 6-to-1 advantage, would have found difficult to quantify. Men who believed the ground was worth it fought differently than men who were holding a position until an exit became available. The front line held for 3 hours. Then the eastern wall gap opened. Lucien pulled back from the defile to the ridge command position as the eastern unit fell, controlled, as ordered, the falling back that looked like routing and wasn't, and watched from elevation as 300 of the Regent's force committed to the eastern wall breach, moving fast, taking the access point with the confidence of men who had just broken through a genuine weakness. They moved into the secondary canyon. He watched the last of them clear the entry point. He looked at Rennes. Rennes raised the signal flag. The third defensive line, on the ridgeline above the secondary canyon, answered. What happened next was not something he would describe in detail to anyone afterward. It was loud, and it was brief, and it was the specific terrible efficiency of a prepared defensive position against a force that had walked into an enclosed space without adequate intelligence about what waited above them. The secondary canyon's 40-foot walls turned it into an amplifier for every sound, and the sounds reached the defile below, and the forces still pressing the primary position heard them. And there was a moment, 5, perhaps 10 seconds, of genuine operational pause as the Regent's commanders on the south approach road processed what they were hearing from the direction they'd sent 300 men. It was 10 seconds. Lucien used 6 of them to get back to the defile. The remaining 4 hours were harder than the first 3. The Regent's commander adjusted. He was a professional, and he adjusted the way professionals did. Fast, without the emotional reaction that burned time and resources, refocusing the main push on the primary defile while sending a secondary force to re-establish the eastern wall approach more cautiously. Lucien's secondary canyon move had cost the Regent 300 men and bought the pass's defenders approximately 90 minutes of reduced pressure while the adjustment processed. 90 minutes was not 4 days. But 90 minutes compounded across repeated exchanges was the mechanism by which 350 intended to outlast 2,000. The problem with the mechanism was the human cost. By the end of the 6th hour, the front defensive line had 63 casualties. The ridge teams had absorbed additional pressure from the repositioned artillery. The secondary canyon unit had held, barely, against the cautious follow-up probe. The eastern wall had changed hands twice. Lucien stood at the defile mouth in the gray afternoon light with blood drying on his armor, most of it not his, and looked at his numbers and did the math for the next 72 hours. The math was very bad. He did not show it. He walked the defensive lines with Rennes and spoke to the men with the specific directness that he had found, in his limited prior combat experience, was the only register that worked under sustained pressure. Not inspiration. Inspiration was for before the battle, and before the battle was 12 hours ago. What worked now was information, clearly delivered, without the artificial confidence that men could smell as performance. They lost more than us today, he told the third defensive line, which was true. They'll adjust overnight and push harder in the morning, which means tomorrow is the hardest day. Also true. Hold the ridge until I tell you otherwise. He did not tell them it would be all right. He had no way of knowing whether it would be all right, and lying to men in a defensive position was a debt that came due at the worst possible moment. He told them what was true and what was required, and let them be the people who decided what to do with it. That was, he had come to understand over the last 3 weeks, and could not entirely explain, something he had learned from watching a woman run an empire's worth of planning from a servant's corridor. You gave people the accurate information and let them decide. The decision was always theirs. You could shape the conditions, but you couldn't make the choice, and the choice was the thing that either held or didn't. The men held. On the second day, Lucien took a second wound, a glancing impact from a poorly aimed artillery round that landed 30 feet short and sent stone fragments into the left side of his torso, with enough force to crack 2 ribs. He was off the defile floor for 40 minutes, while Rennis's field surgeon taped the damage and told him, without any particular gentleness, that returning to the defile was not advisable. He returned to the defile, not because the math improved with him in it. The math was the math regardless of his personal position, because 350 men holding an increasingly desperate position for reasons they understood but hadn't chosen, saw the Duke with cracked ribs back in the front of the canyon and recalibrated their own threshold for what was possible. That was the only thing personal courage was actually for, in his experience, not the outcome. Individual courage didn't determine outcomes at scale. It determined the floor. How low the collective resolve was willing to drop before it stopped holding. He was managing the floor. The second day was harder than the first, as promised. The third day was harder than the second. On the morning of the fourth day, with the defensive lines down to 212 effectives, and the eastern wall in contested status, and the artillery having found, overnight, a positioning that let it strike the northern end of the defile at angles. The defensive distribution hadn't been built to handle. Rennis came to him at the ridge command position with the field assessment and a face that said everything the numbers said. "We can hold the primary defile for another 6 hours," Rennis said. "Maybe 8 if we consolidate the eastern unit and give up that approach entirely. And then we don't hold it." Lucien looked at the maps, at the defile, at the numbers. "She needs 4 days," he said. "It's been 3.5. He looked south, at the road below, at the Regent's force, still vast and still organized despite its losses, which had been significant and which had not been sufficient. 6 more hours, he said. "We might hold 6. "Might isn't no." Rennis looked at him. The field commander had the specific expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to know when a position was being held by something that wasn't purely tactical. "There's a courier," Rennis said. "Arrived at the rear position an hour ago. Came up from the eastern approach. Imperial colors." Lucien turned. "Why didn't you lead with that?" "Because I was leading with the numbers." Rennis held his gaze. "The courier has a message. He says it's from the capital. He says it's urgent." "Everything is urgent." "He says it's from her." The word landed differently than any tactical assessment of the morning. Lucien moved to the rear position. The courier was young and road damaged. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been moving fast for a very long time and had been sustained by the importance of the thing they carried rather than any physical resource. He had imperial colors at his collar and a sealed document in his hand, and he looked at Lucien with the expression of someone who had been told exactly who he was delivering to and was adjusting his expectations to the reality of a duke with cracked ribs and blood on his armor and 212 men holding a canyon against an army. "The message," Lucien said. The courier gave it over. He broke the seal, unfolded it. Her handwriting. He knew it from the document in the East Tower. Clean and precise, with the specific quality of someone who wrote fast but never carelessly. 4 words and a location. Archive secured. Come now. And below that, an address in the capital's administrative district, and a time, and a single additional line that he read twice before his mind produced anything useful. "The High Council has been convened. I need 30 lords to witness what I have. I have 12. If you're not dead, I need you to be here." He folded the document. He looked at the defile below where 212 men were holding ground they'd been holding for 3.5 days. He looked at the road south. He thought, with the specific clarity that arrives sometimes at the edge of genuine exhaustion, about what the next 6 hours required versus what the next 6 hours made possible, and about how those two calculations were not currently pointing in the same direction. "Rennis?" he said. "Sir." "The eastern wall. Give it up. Full consolidation to the primary defile and the ridge. Every available man on those two positions." "We lose the eastern approach." "We lose it in 6 hours anyway." He looked at the defile. "Giving it up now buys us 2 hours of consolidated defensive integrity. 2 hours is what I need." Rennis absorbed this. "You're leaving." "I'm going to end it," Lucian said. "Or I'm going to try. Either way, 2 hours is what I need from you." Rennis looked at the defile, at the numbers, at the road south. 2 hours, he said. "Hold the ridge." "We'll hold it." Lucian moved. He took the courier, 3 of the fastest horses in the rear position, and Petra, who had come from the castle with the military contingent and who had spent 3.5 days running internal security for the defensive position with the same focused efficiency she'd applied to the castle's corridors. And he went south on the road he'd been watching the Regent's army use for 4 days, which was currently unoccupied because the Regent's army was north of him in the pass. The road south was the fastest road south. It was also the road through the Regent's rear logistics position. This was, Lucian acknowledged as he rode at a speed that made his cracked ribs an active and immediate problem, not a good plan. It was not even a plan. It was a decision made on 3.5 days of inadequate sleep, 2 wounds, and 4 words on a piece of paper. And it was the decision that the math and the geography and the specific nature of the situation had produced. And he was executing it because the alternative was holding a canyon for 6 hours and arriving in the capital after whatever was happening in the capital was finished. The Regent's rear logistics position was 3 miles south of Ashwick Pass along the main approach road. They rode through it. This was less dramatic than it sounds and more dangerous than it sounds. Because a rear logistics position was not a combat unit. It was the support infrastructure of a fighting force, which meant it was staffed by administrators and supply staff and medical personnel who were not expecting 3 riders in half-bloodied armor to come down the road from the direction of the battle at full speed, and who, upon seeing them, produced the specific paralysis of non-combat personnel encountering an unexpected situation. Lucien rode through the paralysis. Petra rode through it beside him. The courier rode through it ahead. No one stopped them. Not because no one tried. One supply officer with enough presence of mind to grab a horse and pursue them got 300 yards before Petra, riding rear, made a decision that Lucien didn't look back to observe, and which produced the sound of a horse decelerating rapidly. He didn't ask about it later. 40 miles to the capital. 3 hours at the pace they were holding, which was the pace that good horses could sustain for 40 miles if you were willing to cost them something. And he was willing. He could replace horses. He could not replace the window that 4 words on a piece of paper had told him was open and which would not stay open. The first 20 miles were open road. The last 20 took them into the capital's approaches, which were checkpointed, which had been given orders, which were staffed by imperial soldiers who were not rear logistics personnel and who were not going to have the same paralysis response. He had thought about this. At approximately the speed of a fast horse with the wind making thought, an act of deliberate concentration. "The imperial colors," he said to the courier at the 20-mile mark. "Your uniform." "Sir?" "Stay ahead of us, full speed. When you reach the checkpoint, you're a courier with urgent dispatch from the High Council." "I'm not—" "You're carrying a message from the capital to the capital," Lucian said. "That makes you whatever the checkpoint guards believe you are. Your colors are real. Use them." The courier had enough sense and enough recent exposure to the specific way that Duke Varellis made decisions to not argue the point. The checkpoint went fast. The courier's uniform and the imperial colors did exactly what genuine documentation usually did. Produce the mental shortcut between appearance and authorization in people who were processing 10 couriers an hour and did not have time to interrogate each one. By the time the guards processed that the full party included 2 people in armor that didn't match any current imperial deployment, Lucien and Petra were through. The second checkpoint didn't go as smoothly. One of the guards had better instincts or better briefing or simply the misfortune of being more attentive than average, and he stepped into the road with his hand on his sword and looked at Lucien with the specific expression of someone who was doing mental pattern matching against a description he'd been given. "Name," he said. "Duke Lucien Varellis," Lucien said, "and I'm in a hurry." The guard's expression completed its pattern match. His hand tightened on the sword. "The Duke is—" He stopped. The internal conflict between what he'd been told and what was standing in front of him produced a 2-second gap. Petra used the 2 seconds. The guard was on the ground. Not dead. Petra was precise about what she did and didn't do, and this situation didn't require dead, but substantially occupied with not being on the ground anymore, which was going to take him some time. They rode through. The capital streets were the streets of a city that knew something was wrong, but hadn't yet been given the specific shape of it. People moved with the particular accelerated purposefulness of civilians operating on incomplete information, faster than usual, quieter than usual, with the eyes-forward quality of those who have assessed that what's happening around them is above their pay grade to engage with directly. He found the address from the message in the administrative district, which was exactly where a man with 12 years of careful acquisition would have placed an archive property, adjacent enough to the power centers to be convenient, removed enough from the primary political theater to be overlooked. The eastern approach was manned, as promised, by Aldous and 4 imperial guards who had stopped pretending to be civilians approximately an hour ago, based on their formation and their expressions, and the fact that 2 of them had their weapons drawn in positions that suggested they had recently been necessary. Aldous looked at Lucien, at the armor, at the blood, at the cracked rib quality of the way he was moving. "She said you'd come," Aldous said. "The building," Lucien said. "Second floor, north room." Aldous moved aside. "There are 31 lords of the High Council currently assembled in the ground floor hall. She got the other 19 in the last 2 hours. 31. He had not thought she would get 31. He went in. The archive was a room that smelled of old paper and the particular staleness of a space that had been sealed more than opened, and Seraphine was standing at its center with a stack of documents on the table in front of her, and an expression that registered for approximately 1 full second, something she didn't entirely suppress before she rebuilt the controlled surface. He had not thought he would get here. He thought she had not been entirely certain he would either. "You're hurt," she said. "Manageable. The archive. Complete." She put her hand on the stack. 12 years of correspondence. His planning documents for the massacre. His communication with the regent before and after. Names, dates, instructions. She looked at him. Everything. He looked at the stack. 12 years. In paper. On a table in a room that smelled of old secrets. 31 lords, he said. 31 who came when called. 6 more who sent representatives with authority to commit their seal. She watched him. "It's enough. It's more than enough for a formal council adjudication. Hale is currently in the council hall." Her voice had a particular quality. Not satisfaction, not relief. The compressed steadiness of someone who has been running at capacity for a very long time and has not yet allowed themselves to acknowledge what it's cost. "He doesn't know what I have. He came because 31 lords of the High Council requested his presence, and declining was a statement he wasn't prepared to make." "And the regent?" "The regent is not in the capital." She held his gaze. "He's commanding the force at Ashwick." He processed that. "The regent himself," he said, "left the capital 3 days ago, personally commanding." She watched something move across his face. "Which means he left the council without executive authority. Which means what happens in that hall in the next hour is not subject to his veto until he returns. And by the time he returns, the adjudication will have concluded." He looked at her. She had found the window. Not the window in the military geography, not the window in the capital's political calendar, not any of the windows he'd been able to see from Ashwick Pass. The window she'd found was the one created by a man who had decided to personally command the force that was going to end her, and who had in doing so removed himself from the place where the actual decisive event was going to happen. Patient men who were very good at waiting had one consistent weakness. She had told him that 3 weeks ago, in the East Tower. "He underestimated you," Lucien said. "He underestimated what 5 years of watching the Empire from its corridors teaches you about how it actually functions," she said. The regent commands. Hale administers. When the commander leaves, administration is what's left. An administration without command authority is just paper. She touched the archive stack. And I have better paper than he does. He looked at her across the table of 12 years of evidence in a room that smelled of old secrets, and he thought about 3.5 days in a mountain canyon, and he thought about 212 men on a ridge, and he thought about what it cost to build something like this. Not the archive, not the political configuration, but the will to build it. The specific discipline required to spend 5 years constructing a weapon out of patience and loss, and the kind of cold that got structural. The hall, he said. Are you ready for it? Are you? She looked at him. In the lamplight of the archive room, her face had the quality of someone who had been moving for a very long time toward a specific moment and was now in the seconds just before it, and finding that the moment was exactly what she'd built it to be, and also nothing like she'd anticipated, because moments were always both of those things at once. I've been ready for 12 years, she said. They went downstairs. The hall was a high-ceilinged room with the specific grandeur of a building designed to make the people inside it feel the weight of what was transacted here, and it was occupied by 31 lords of the High Council and their attendants and the 6 representatives of the lords who hadn't come in person, and at the far end of the long table, with the expression of a man who was managing very precisely what his face was doing, sat Devereux Hale. He was older than she had described him. Or perhaps he was the same age and had simply acquired the particular quality of a man who had spent 12 years maintaining a version of himself that wasn't entirely accurate, which aged differently than living honestly. He had a careful face, the same face Corvin had, she thought, the face of someone who processed information with visible effort. And he looked at her when she entered with the specific expression of a man whose world had just reorganized itself into a shape he hadn't modeled. He looked, for the first time in what she imagined was 12 years, surprised. She set the archive on the table. Councilman Hale, she said. Her voice carried without being raised. The hall's acoustics were designed for it. I think you know who I am. 31 lords of the High Council looked at the archive, looked at her, looked at the man at the far end of the table whose careful face was becoming, degree by degree, something else. Hale looked at the stack of documents. 12 years. He looked at her. She watched the moment in which he understood, fully and completely, and without the protective fog of uncertainty, that the thing he had spent 12 years managing had just arrived at its conclusion, and the conclusion was not the one he had designed. He stood. He stood because men like him, men who had spent years in rooms of power, stood when the ground shifted because standing was the residual performance of authority, even when the authority was gone. And standing was also, she understood, the movement of a man who was calculating exit options and determining whether any of them remained open. The doors, she said, without looking away from Hale. Aldous, at the hall's entrance, closed them. Hale looked at the closed doors. He looked at 31 lords who were looking at the archive documents that his own correspondence staff had distributed to each seat in the 30 seconds before his entrance. The distribution she had arranged with the specific logistical precision of someone who had been planning this particular room layout for a very long time. He looked at Lucien, who was standing at the hall's edge in damaged armor, with the quality of a man who had ridden 40 miles in 3 hours and was not even slightly interested in sitting down. He looked at her. You don't have the authority, he said, for any of this. You have no validated claim, no coronation, no council sanction. I have the archive, she said. Documents can be fabricated. By someone with access to your private seal, your handwriting, your correspondence codes for the 12-year communication with the regent that's detailed in Section 4? She watched his face. You're welcome to argue that, in front of 31 lords who are currently reading Section 4. The hall was very quiet. The regent, she said, is at Ashwick Pass, currently managing a military engagement that has cost him, by last count, several hundred men and 3.5 days of forward progress against a defensive force 1/6 his size. She held Hale's gaze. While he was doing that, you were here, and the council was here, and the archive was here. Something crossed Hale's face, not the surprise. The surprise was gone. What replaced it was something she recognized, something she had seen on the face of every person who had ever fully understood the nature of a trap in the moment of closing. The specific quality of a man realizing that the patience he had believed was his greatest asset had been used against him by someone who had been more patient. 12 years, she said quietly, quiet enough that only he could hear it. You waited 12 years. I waited 5. She looked at him across the table and across the archive and across the weight of everything she had carried to get to this room. I learned faster. The hall doors behind her remained closed. 31 lords of the High Council read Section 4 of a 12-year archive. Hale stood at the far end of the table with no exit that didn't require walking through every person in this room. And the people in this room were reading documents, and the documents were in their hands, and they were real. Lucian watched from the hall's edge. He was watching her, not Hale. She stood at the head of the table with the compressed stillness of someone who had spent 5 years running toward this moment and had arrived at it and found that arrival was its own kind of weight, heavier than the running had been, because the running had direction and arrival had only itself, and the itself was enormous and strange and nothing like she had fully anticipated. She had anticipated everything else. She had not entirely anticipated this. One of the lords, older, northern accent, a man she identified from her research as Lord Cavendris, who had been neutral on every significant vote for 12 years, set down his copy of Section 4 and looked at her. Your Highness, he said. It was a statement, not a question, not a conditional, not the beginning of a negotiation, a statement. The hall was very quiet. Across the table, Hale's face had gone to the color of old candle wax, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just watched 5 years of someone else's patience collapse 12 years of his own, and who was now doing the same arithmetic he had imposed on her family and finding that the numbers no longer worked in any direction he could run. The door opened. Not the main doors. The side entrance. A soldier. Imperial uniform. Out of breath. He looked at the room, processed its current configuration, looked at Seraphine. Message from Ashwick Pass, Your Highness. The title arrived automatically, as if the room's configuration had already communicated what he needed to know. From Captain Rennis. She held out her hand. He gave her the dispatch. She read it. She read it again. Then she looked at Lucian. His expression asked the question. She held out the dispatch. He read it. She watched his face, watched the specific sequence of expressions that moved across it. The military assessment first, then the implications of the military assessment, then the thing underneath the implications that he allowed to surface for approximately 2 seconds before he put it back where he kept everything that cost him something. The dispatch was 12 words. Ridge holding, Duke not here. Where is he? Send word. Rennis. And below Rennis's hand, added by the courier who had ridden from Ashwick, a single additional sentence. Regent's force has halted. They're waiting for orders that aren't coming. She looked at Lucien. He looked at her. The Regent was at Ashwick Pass, commanding a force that had just received word, through whatever reporting chain the third channel had been using before she burned it, that the capital had not waited for his return. The force was waiting for orders. The orders came from the Regent. The Regent came from the capital, but the capital, the council, the lords, the administrative machinery of an empire, was no longer waiting for the Regent. The capital was in this room, and this room was looking at an archive. Hale sat down, not with dignity, not with the performance of a man accepting a situation. He sat down the way a structure sat down when the load-bearing element was removed, not collapsing exactly, but no longer able to maintain the form that the load had required. Seraphine looked at 31 lords of the High Council. She looked at the archive on the table. She looked at Lucien in damaged armor at the hall's edge, who had ridden 40 miles on cracked ribs through the Regent's own rear position to be standing in this room at this moment, and who was looking at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision 3.5 days ago in an East Tower and was now watching the decision produce its consequence, and was finding the consequence more complex than any consequence he had previously encountered. She looked at Hale. She opened her mouth. Whatever she said next would be the first words spoken by the heir of the imperial bloodline in a room with the authority to hear them. Whatever she said next would determine whether the next 5 minutes were the end of something or the beginning of something, and she understood, in the specific clarity of the moment, that those were not the same thing, and that choosing between them was the choice she had been building toward for 5 years, and that the choice was entirely hers. She looked at the room. She spoke. She said, "Read the archive." That was all. 2 words, in a room with 31 lords and a man who had organized 12 years of the Empire's worst history, and she chose the 2 words that required the least performance and accomplished the most. She stepped back from the table and let the paper speak, because paper, unlike people, didn't have the capacity for theater, and theater was the thing that had kept the truth buried for 12 years, and she was done with it. Hale understood what was happening before the Third Lord finished his section. She watched him understand it. She had spent 5 years imagining this specific moment, the moment when the man who had signed documents at her father's desk while her father's body was still in the room would finally reckon with the arithmetic of what he'd built. And the imagined version had contained something she could only call satisfaction, which she had examined in the planning years and decided was legitimate and set aside for later, and now found, sitting in the actual room with the actual man, was entirely absent. What was present instead was something she had no clean word for. Not pity, not mercy. Something more like the recognition that arrives when you've been carrying a weight for so long that the weight has become structural, and putting it down doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the particular vertigo of a body adjusting to a different configuration of its own load. She was adjusting. Lord Cavendish set down his final page and looked at Hale. The look had nothing complex in it. It was the look of a man who had been given clarity about something he had chosen for 12 years to treat as ambiguous, and who was now making the decision he should have made when the ambiguity was thinner. "The council will convene formally," Cavendish said. "Adjudication of the archive by this afternoon." No one objected. Hale sat at the far end of the table with his hands flat on the wood and said nothing. The specific silence of a man who has exhausted every option and knows it. Not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of calculation that has found no remaining output. He was not a stupid man. That was the thing she had understood about him from the beginning, and which the archive confirmed on every page. He was a patient, intelligent, careful man who had made a set of decisions that were coherent within their own logic and catastrophic in their consequences. And he was now sitting in the room where the consequences had finally outrun the logic. She looked at him and thought about the 7-year-old in the corridor, the blood on her shoes, the woman whose name she never learned, guiding her through the dark. She thought about what she wanted from this moment. The answer, which arrived without drama, surprised her. Not his suffering, not his public unraveling, not the satisfaction of watching him reckon with the specific weight of what he'd done. She wanted it to be over. She wanted the thing that had been pursuing her for 12 years. Not the man, not his network, not even the regent's political machinery, but the specific unresolved state of her own history. To close. To have a form and a limit and an end. To stop being the thing that organized everything else. "Councilman Hale," she said. He looked at her. "You will cooperate with the formal adjudication," she said. "Fully. The names, the dates, the chain of command. Everything that isn't in the archive, you'll provide." She held his gaze. "Not because I'm asking, because what you have left to bargain with is the manner of this ending, and that's only worth bargaining with if you start now." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. His voice had lost its careful quality. What was left underneath was the voice of a man who was old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Why offer a bargain?" "Because the men who died in that palace were not brought back by your suffering," she said. "And the people who've been living under 12 years of the political order you built were not served by it. What serves them is a clean adjudication with a full record." She looked at the archive. "You built something meticulous. Give the council the same meticulousness in dismantling it." Hale looked at his hands. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." She walked away from the table. Lucienne was at the hall's edge where she'd last seen him, and she crossed the room toward him with the particular feeling of moving through a space that had just changed its nature entirely. The way rooms changed after significant events, the air different, the light different. The geometry of standing in it shifted by what had occurred. He looked at her when she reached him. She looked at him. There was a great deal that needed to be said, and none of it was available right now, and they were both aware of this. And there was a quality in the awareness, the shared knowledge of the gap between what was present and what was sayable, that communicated something the words would have been insufficient for anyway. "The Regent's force," she said. "Still at Ashwick, last report. He'll know within the hour." "Yes." When he knows, the men at Ashwick will have to make a decision." Lucienne looked at the hall, at the Lords, at the archive. "They'll make the right one." "You believe that?" "I believe," he said, "that an army that's been bled for 4 days by 350 men in a mountain pass does not have sufficient conviction remaining to continue a campaign whose political basis has just been dissolved by the man they were campaigning against." He looked at her. "They were loyal to the Regent's authority. The Regent's authority just became very complicated." She understood. Not loyalty to a person. Loyalty to the structure the person represented. When the structure shifted, the loyalty had to recalibrate. And recalibrating while standing in a mountain pass with significant casualties and a hostile defensive force on the ridge above you was a complicated recalibration. "You should sit," she said. "Your ribs." "I've been standing on cracked ribs for 2 days." "Then sit because you can now," she said. "Because this is the room where the next hour gets decided, and I need you present for it. And present means functional, and functional means I'm fine." "Lucienne." He looked at her. She looked back. He sat. It was, she would think later, the most significant single concession she had ever observed him make, because it was not political and not strategic and not the product of any calculation she could trace. It was just a man with cracked ribs sitting down because someone had asked him to, and the someone was her, and the asking had come from a place that was not negotiation. She stood beside him while the High Council of the Empire formally convened and began the process of disassembling 12 years of Devereux Hale's patient architecture, and she thought about what came after. After was a word she had not permitted herself to use in 5 years. Not because she was pessimistic about surviving, she had been, at every stage, reasonably confident in the planning, but because after was the word that belonged to a life organized around something other than the immediate survival objective. And the immediate survival objective had been all-consuming enough that after had seemed like a luxury she could defer indefinitely. It was no longer deferrable. The formal adjudication took 4 hours. Hale cooperated. She had been right about that. He had enough intelligence to understand the arithmetic of what remained to him, and what remained to him was the manner and extent of his own accounting, and he gave the council what the archive alone couldn't give it: the sequence, the reasoning, the names of individuals who had participated in the original event and who had continued to benefit from its outcome, and who were, in several cases, present in this room or in adjacent rooms in this building. It was a thorough dismantling. She sat through most of it with the quality of someone who has been waiting for a specific piece of information and is now receiving it in the specific form of an old man's careful voice recounting, with the exactitude of a man who had been meticulous about everything, the things he had done and why. The why was, she found, the part she hadn't anticipated. Not the grandiosity of it. She had expected some version of grandiosity, the revolutionary's conviction that the end justified its means. What she got instead was smaller and worse. Hale had decided that the imperial bloodline, in its then current form, was structurally incompatible with the administrative modernization the empire needed to survive the next century. He had not wanted power for himself. He had wanted a different kind of power in place, a council model, distributed, accountable. And he had decided, with the cold patience that was his primary characteristic, that the fastest path to it was the removal of the structure that prevented it. He had been, in his own conception, a reformer. He had organized the death of her family in the service of a theory about better governance. She sat with that for the length of the adjudication's 3rd hour and found that it was harder to process than villainy would have been. Villainy had edges. This had none. This was the specific horror of a man who had looked at something genuinely wrong. And there had been things genuinely wrong with her father's administration. She had learned enough in 5 years of research to know that, and had concluded that the fastest correction required the most catastrophic instrument, and had been wrong in the most irreversible way possible, and had spent 12 years administering the consequences of being wrong. She did not forgive him. She did not need to forgive him. Forgiveness was a transaction that required the consent of the person who'd been damaged, and she was the only person in the room qualified to manage what she extended to Devereaux Hale. And what she extended was not forgiveness, but something more ruthless and more useful. The determination to spend no more of her remaining life being organized around his decisions. He had made her run for 5 years. He had made her invisible for 5 years. He had made her carry a weight that had become structural. The weight was hers to set down now. That was what the adjudication was, she understood in the third hour. Not justice exactly. Justice implied a restoration of what had been, and what had been was her family and her childhood and the life that corridor had ended, and none of that was restorable. The adjudication was accounting. The Empire making a record of what had occurred, in the specific formal language that turned events into facts and facts into history, and history into the thing that the living used to build the future. She was going to be in the record. The thought was strange enough that she sat with it for a few minutes without trying to do anything with it. Seraphine Vale, formerly maid of the third household level, Castle Varellis, previously the lost heir of the imperial bloodline, was going to be in the Empire's formal historical record as the person who had walked into its administrative hall with a 12-year archive and 31 lords and changed the shape of what came next. Strange. She thought about the kitchen girl with the reading lessons and the loose stone in the scullery wall. She thought about the wine steward who hadn't known what was in the note. She thought about Renaud in a small morning room, looking at his hands. She thought about Corvin, 23 years old, who had made one catastrophically wrong decision for a reason she understood, and who had, in the end, helped them close the channel he'd been operating. She thought about Petra, who had run the night watch and left covered plates of food outside a specific unused door every third evening for a man with nowhere else to go. She thought about what it meant that these were the people she had been thinking about for the last 3 weeks, with the same regularity that she thought about Hale and the Regent and the archive. What it meant that the shape of what she was building, or what she wanted to build after, included all of them. She had spent 5 years building a weapon. She was beginning to understand that the weapon had been built in order to build something else. The Regent arrived in the capital on the second day following the adjudication. Not with his army. His army had done exactly what Lucienne had predicted, which was that it had spent the morning of the 5th day at Ashwick Pass receiving word of the Council's formal adjudication and proceedings against both the Regent and Hale, and had then engaged in the particular organizational behavior of a force whose commanding purpose has been removed. Not dissolution, armies didn't dissolve, but a kind of operational suspension, a holding pattern, while the men with rank and the men with ranks reports worked through what the change in political structure meant for their current orders. The Regent had ridden south alone, with 6 guards and the specific quality of a man running a calculation he already knew the answer to. He came to the council hall. He did not come voluntarily. He came because the only alternative was open military revolt against a formal council adjudication supported by 31 Lord Seals and a 12-year archive. And that calculation produced an outcome that even the Regent could not model as survivable. He came into the hall and he looked at the room and he looked at the archive and he looked at Seraphine, and she thought, meeting his gaze across the distance of that room, that she was looking at the specific face of a man who had made a decision long ago and had built an entire system on top of it, and who was now watching the system resolve into its final form, and the final form was not the one he'd managed toward. He did not look frightened. She had expected something like fear. What he looked like was tired, the kind of tired that had nothing to do with physical rest and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of maintaining a constructed reality for a very long time and watching it finally stop requiring maintenance because it was simply gone. She said his name. He looked at her. "The council has ruled," she said. "You know the terms." "I know the terms," he said. His voice was flat in the way of someone who had already moved past the event to the logistics of the event's aftermath. Formal abdication of regency. full cooperation with the adjudication supplementary inquiry, exile to the Eastern Territories under house restriction. Yes. Not execution, he said. Not execution, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. The Hale theory, he said, about distributed power, the council model. I've read it. He wasn't wrong about the diagnosis, the regent said. She looked at him. He was wrong about the instrument, he said. But the diagnosis, the structural problem he identified, that wasn't wrong. No, she said, it wasn't. The regent looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't categorize and didn't try to. Then fix it, he said. Correctly. He sat. The formal proceedings took the rest of the afternoon. She walked out of the council hall at dusk into air that smelled of the capital's evening, stone and smoke, and the particular dust of a city that had been moving all day and was beginning to settle. And she stood on the steps for a moment with no particular objective and let herself feel the specific quality of a body that had been operating under sustained pressure for an extended period and had just found that the pressure had changed. Not gone. Changed. Different in its nature and weight and direction. Lucien came out behind her. He moved with the specific care of someone managing ribs that had been cracked for 4 days and were not appreciating the activity levels they'd been subjected to. And she was aware of this and did not say anything about it because she had said something about it, and he had sat down for approximately 20 minutes and then stood up again, and there was no further territory to cover on the subject. He stood beside her on the steps. The capital spread below them in the dusk light. The administrative district's stone buildings, the broader city beyond, the smoke and the movement, and the particular noise of a place that had spent 2 days operating on the edge of significant political change and was now processing what that change was going to mean in the daily arithmetic of existing here. The regent's eastern territories, Lucien said. He'll comply, she said. He's not a man who makes gestures. If he said he'd go, he'll go. And Hale. Council detention pending the supplementary inquiry. They'll want the full chain of names. She looked at the city. It's going to take months. Yes. The empire doesn't restructure in a week. No. She thought about what the regent had said. The diagnosis and the instrument, the structural problem that Hale had identified and addressed with the most catastrophic possible tool. She thought about what correctly looked like. I'm not going to take the throne, she said. Lucien was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. She looked at him. You've known since when? She said. Since the library, he said. 3 weeks ago. You described why you stayed below, why the servants' corridors gave you something a throne wouldn't. You weren't describing a temporary position. You were describing a permanent epistemology. She looked at the city. Epistemology, she said. You know things from below that you can't know from above. Taking the throne doesn't change what you know. It changes what you can see. He paused. And you've spent 5 years building something that requires being able to see. She was quiet for a moment. The council, she said. The distributed model. What Hale wanted to create, the architecture of it wasn't wrong, just the method. If the model is built correctly, with the right oversight structures, with the adjudication mechanisms that prevent it becoming its own kind of concentrated power, it needs someone who understands power from both directions, Lucien said. Yes. Someone who's been below it and has been made to stand above it. Yes. Someone who won't be seduced by either position. She looked at him. You're describing me, she said. I'm describing what I've observed, he said. In 3 weeks and 14 months before that. She turned back to the city. The dusk was deepening, the buildings losing their definition into the blue-gray mass of an imperial capital, settling into evening. Somewhere in this city, there were 31 lords and their staffs and the machinery of an empire that had just undergone a significant structural event and was waiting to understand what form came next. Somewhere, there was Hale in council detention and the regent preparing for an eastern exile, and Corvin with his family, safe in a safe house, and Renault in a castle that was no longer under artillery fire, and 212 men on a ridge at Ashwick, who were going to need to be told what they'd held that ridge for. Somewhere there was a kitchen girl with reading lessons in a loose stone. I want to go back to the castle, she said. Lucy Chen looked at her. Not to stay, she said. Not as a permanent position, to... She stopped. Renault, Petra, the people who held it. She found the right word. To account for what they did. In person. That's 2 days' travel. Yes. On roads that are currently occupied by a recently suspended military force. The roads will clear, she said. The force has no current operational command. They'll consolidate at the nearest garrison and wait for instruction. He looked at the city. The council needs to know your intentions, he said. About the restructuring, about the distributed model. They'll have questions. I'll answer the questions. Some of them will want you on the throne regardless of your position on the matter. Let them want it, she said. Wanting and having are different. I've been managing that distinction for 5 years. Something moved at the edge of his mouth. I'll arrange the travel, he said. She looked at him. Your ribs, she said, are cracked, not broken. The difference is manageable. You're going to ride 2 days on cracked ribs because the castle is my home, he said, and because the people in it held a ridge for 4 days at my request, and I want to be the one to tell them why. He met her gaze. And because I'm not going to send you on a 2-day road journey through recently suspended military territory without being there. She looked at him for a moment. That last part, she said. Yes. Is that arrangement or... It's what it is, he said. I don't have better language for it right now. I've been awake for most of 4 days. She looked at the city. When you have better language, she said, I'll use it. They stood on the steps of the council hall as the capital finished its transition into night, and she did not move toward anything or away from anything, and for the first time in 5 years she was not running a calculation about the next position, the next contingency, the next move in the sequence she'd been building since a corridor and blood on her shoes. She was standing still. It was, she found, extremely uncomfortable. She thought this was probably correct. The road back to Varellis took 3 days, not 2, because on the second morning Lucien's ribs made a definitive case for slower travel that even he couldn't entirely override, and she did not say anything about it and simply adjusted the pace, and he did not thank her for not saying anything, and this was, she thought, a reasonable approximation of how most things between them functioned. They talked. This was the thing she hadn't expected. Not that they would talk, but that the talking would have the quality it had. For 3 weeks in the castle, they had talked in the specific register of 2 people managing an operational situation together, which was a genuine kind of talk but which had its own constraints, its own forward momentum, its own requirement that everything said served the immediate problem. On the road, with the immediate problem behind them and the next set of problems still forming, the talk had no required direction. It went everywhere. He told her about the 3rd day in the pass, not strategically, not the tactical decisions, but the texture of it, the specific quality of standing in a defile with cracked ribs and reduced numbers, and the knowledge that the math was not improving, and finding that the knowledge produced, rather than despair, something that felt like the cleanest version of his own function. The clarity that arrived, he said, when all the variables were finally reduced to the ones that actually mattered. The pass, he said, on the 2nd day, as they rode through lowland terrain with the early spring light still flat and cold but present. I understood something there that I hadn't understood before. What? He was quiet for a moment. I've been feared for most of my adult life, he said. Not respected, not trusted. Feared. He looked at the road. I built that deliberately. Fear is reliable. Fear doesn't recalibrate based on your recent performance or your current political relevance. Fear is a consistent tool. Yes. The pass, he said. The men held the pass not because they feared me. Several of them had reasons, by the 3rd day, to be significantly more afraid of staying in the pass than of whatever I might do if they left it. He paused. They held it because I was in it. And I was in it not because it was the strategically optimal position, but because I had made a commitment to a specific outcome for a specific reason, and the reason required being there. She looked at him. That's different from fear, she said. Completely different, he said. Fear's about what I might do. That was about what I'd already decided I was. He looked at the road ahead. I'm not sure I knew the difference before 3 weeks ago. She thought about this for a while. The wine steward, she said. Yes. You released him before morning, on the first night. I said I would. You also didn't have to, she said. It was a condition of mine. You could have argued it. I could have. You didn't. No. She looked at the road. That was the first thing, she said. The first thing that didn't fit the model I had of you. He looked at her. You had a model, he said. I always have a model, she said. I had studied you for 14 months. The model was detailed. She paused. The wine steward didn't fit it. What did the model say I'd do? Delay, she said. Pending verification that the release was genuinely cost-free. Standard political caution. She looked at him. You released him because you said you would. That's not political caution. That's something else. He was quiet for a moment. My father, he said, was a man who said things and didn't mean them. Not from malice. From the specific kind of weakness that looks like practicality. The belief that words are negotiating positions rather than commitments. That everything is adjustable based on subsequent conditions. He paused. I decided at some point that I wouldn't be that. That if I said a thing, the thing would happen, regardless of subsequent conditions. That's not entirely strategic. No, he said, it's not. It's probably the least strategic thing about me. She thought about the document in the East Tower with both their signatures. The arrangement between parties, not wardship or custody. The specific language of a man who understood that words were the architecture of what came after them. The old man, she said, in the unused room, the former secretary. My father's, yes. You kept him. He had nowhere else. That's not a strategic reason. No, he said. It's not. She looked at the road. You've been building something, she said, in that castle for years, before I arrived. She thought about Petra's covered plates, and the kitchen girl's loose stone, and Tomas's knees, and the 31 years of Renault's service, and the way the household had operated, not on fear alone, but on the knowledge that Lucien Varellis was the most dependable constant in the lives of everyone inside his walls. You didn't know you were building it. You were just making decisions that fit a specific internal requirement, and the decisions accumulated. He said nothing for a moment. What did they accumulate into? He said. Something that looks, she said carefully, a lot like the kind of institution I'm trying to figure out how to build for the Empire. He looked at her. She looked at the road. Don't say that like it's a compliment, he said. It's an observation. You're telling me my household is a model for imperial restructuring. I'm telling you that the thing you built without knowing you were building it is evidence of something functional, something that works not because people fear the consequences of it failing, but because they've decided it's worth maintaining. She paused. That's rare. It's actually extremely rare. Most institutions that function that way get there by accident and lose it before anyone can study them. He was quiet for a long time. And you want to study it, he said. I want to understand how it happened, she said, so it can happen again, deliberately, at scale. He looked at the road. That's a very large project, he said. Yes. It would take years. Yes. It would require access to a functioning example. Yes, she said, it would. He said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough to have its own geography. The North, he said. The North, she agreed. House Varellis. You're the most politically isolated of the northern lords who aren't already in a compromised network, she said. Your self-interest is sophisticated enough that you make decisions based on long-term structural value rather than immediate advantage. And your household is, you already used this speech, he said. When I first came to you, yes. The version where you're assessing my usefulness. The version where I was telling you the truth about why I chose you, she said, which I have continued to do. And now you're telling me the truth about why you want to stay. She looked at him. I'm telling you the truth about the project, she said, which is the most honest thing I know how to offer anyone. She paused. The other reasons are, she stopped. Our what? The road was flat ahead of them. The lowland terrain was opening into the wider country that preceded the northern territories. She could feel, in the air, the particular change in temperature that marked the approach of the North Gi. Colder, cleaner, the smell of stone and winter even in spring's edge. Harder to say with the same precision, she said. He was quiet. Take your time, he said. She did. She thought about the library at 2 in the morning and the book closed in his hand. She thought about the survey mislabeled on the third shelf. She thought about the document in the East Tower and the pen he'd left beside it, and the specific quality of a man who understood that clarity was what you built when you wanted something to survive you. She thought about the armory and the grinding wheel and the sparks. She thought about cracked ribs and 40 miles and 4 words on a piece of paper. She thought about the particular thing that had happened somewhere in the last 3 weeks to the weight she'd been carrying since she was 7 years old. Not its removal, but its redistribution. The sense of a load being shared not because she'd asked for help, but because someone had decided, without being asked, to stand in the same ground. You told me once, she said, that after was after, that we'd deal with it when it came. Yes. It's after, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at the road ahead. I'm better at planning toward things than arriving at them, she said. I've spent 5 years building toward a specific moment. The moment has happened. She found the honest word. Disoriented. That seems appropriate, he said. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with the disorientation. Nothing, he said. She looked at him. You're supposed to be disoriented, he said. You've been running at capacity for 5 years. The capacity doesn't just restructure because the objective is achieved. The disorientation is what restructuring feels like. He looked at the road. It passes. You sound certain. I'm familiar with it, he said. After the second campaign, after my father died, after certain other decisions. He paused. It passes. And what comes after it is not what you were before. It's something else. He met her gaze briefly. Usually better, sometimes just different. Either way, not the same. She thought about that for a while. The castle, she said. 2 more hours, he said, at this pace. She looked at the road. Castle Varellis appeared in the mid-afternoon light as it always appeared. Black stone against the northern sky, severe and old, with the particular quality of a thing that had been standing in the same place through enough history that it had developed its own gravity. She had spent 14 months learning its corridors from below. She had spent 3 weeks inhabiting it from the East Tower. She was looking at it now from the approach road with the specific vision of someone who had left it under artillery fire and returned with the political situation fundamentally altered. And it looked, she thought, exactly the same. The stone didn't care what had happened in the capital. The walls held what they held. The lights in the guard towers meant Petra had maintained the night watch rotation regardless of everything else, which was entirely consistent with Petra's character and which produced, in Seraphine's chest, a specific warmth she didn't try to categorize. The gate opened before they reached it. Petra was in the courtyard. She looked at them both with the specific assessment of a woman who had been managing a castle under artillery fire and reduced capacity and no definitive information about what was happening in the capital, and who had clearly made the administrative decision that assuming continued operations was preferable to assuming the worst, and who now looked at the 2 people riding through her gate and was doing the rapid recalibration that competent people did when incoming information required it. The pass, Lucian said. Rennis brought the men back 2 days ago, Petra said. Full count is down to 194 effectives. The Ridge teams took the heaviest losses. She looked at him. You should know. They've been calling it something. What? The Duke's Wall, she said. What the men at the Ridge are calling it. The pass. She said it without inflection, the plain delivery of information that carried its own weight without requiring elaboration. Lucienne absorbed this. She watched something happen in his face that was not the fractional movement she'd catalogued in the early weeks. Something fuller. Something he didn't immediately rebuild over. Renaud, Seraphine said. In the household, Petra said. He's been subdued, but functional. He's been asking. About. About what happens next, Petra said. About whether... She stopped, chose the word. Whether he still has a place here. Seraphine looked at the castle. Take me to him, she said. She found Renaud in the records room, which was where a man who had organized a great household's administrative life for 19 years apparently went when he needed to exist somewhere that made sense to him. He was at the filing shelves, not filing, just standing near them, with the quality of someone occupying a familiar space because the space itself was steadying. He heard her come in, turned. The expression on his face was one she recognized. She had worn versions of it herself for 5 years. The specific configuration of a person who had been carrying damage long enough that it had gotten into the posture, into the way they took up space, into the quality of how they prepared themselves to be seen. Renaud, she said. Your Highness, he said. Seraphine, she said. As it was before. He looked at her. I don't think... I've been a maid in this castle, she said. I've cleaned these floors. I've filed these shelves. She looked at the records. The third shelf has been mislabeled since my 2nd month here. I never corrected it because no one was looking for what I'd put there. She looked at him. You were the person in this castle I was most uncertain about telling. Not because I didn't trust you, because I knew if you knew it would cost you something. It already has. Renaud's jaw worked. I gave him information, he said. You answered questions from a man who had positioned himself as someone safe to answer questions to, she said. Because your son was there and you were a father, and fathers answer questions when sons are involved. She looked at him. You understand what you participated in. You don't need me to explain it differently, but you should know, and this is the accurate information, not comfort, that your son is safe. He's been moved. The consortium connection is dissolved. The leverage is gone. She paused. And the castle needs its steward. Renaud was very still. The Duke will tell you himself, she said, but I'm telling you first, because you deserve to hear it without politics in it. He looked at her. You're not taking the throne, he said. It wasn't a question. He had apparently been thinking about the possible outcomes. No. Then what? Something that requires more patience and probably less glamour, she said. Rebuilding what the last 12 years damaged, not from above, from beside. She looked at the records room, at the shelves, starting probably with a filing system. Something happened in Renaud's expression, not laughter. He was too thoroughly wrung out for laughter, but the edge of it, the specific softening around the mouth that preceded it. The third shelf, he said, has been driving me functionally insane for 14 months, she said. He made the sound that was almost laughter. She left him to the shelves. She found Petra in the corridor outside, and they walked together toward the eastern wing, and she told Petra the outline of what was coming. The council proceedings, the regent's exile, the distributed model that would require implementation over months and years, and Petra listened with the specific quality of a person who was filing information at high speed and producing parallel assessments as she received it. The kitchen girl, Seraphine said. She's been reading in the evenings, Petra said. In the scullery, the stone is still loose. Good, she said. I want to know her name. Petra looked at her. Her name is Lena, she said. She's 17. Her mother is one of the dairy staff. Lena, she said. She would find Lena tomorrow. She had things she needed to say that would require more energy than she had right now, and saying them without sufficient energy would make them into something smaller than what they were, and they needed to be what they were. She went to the East Tower. She sat in the room where she had spent 3 weeks planning the thing that had just happened, and she looked at the table where the document had been signed, and she looked at the window where she had watched the staged departure in the dark, and she thought about what Lucien had said on the road. What comes after is not what you were before. She thought about the 7-year-old in the corridor. She had spent 12 years in some configuration or another trying to do something for that child, to make the running worth something, to turn the loss into a ledger that eventually balanced. She had organized the entirety of her adult cognition around the question of what that child was owed. She sat in the East Tower room and understood, for the first time, that the question had been wrong. Not because the child wasn't owed something, she had been. The massacre was real, and the loss was real, and 12 years of hiding were real, and none of that was reducible. But the question of what the child was owed had been asked in the language of debt, and debt was a language of completion. Pay the debt, close the ledger, restore the balance. And what she understood now, in the quiet of this room, with the archives secure in the capital and the regent eastward bound and Hale cooperating with the adjudication, was that the ledger did not close. It didn't close because what the child was owed wasn't reparable by any event, however significant. The event was real and necessary. The archive, the adjudication, the accounting, all of it was real and necessary. But none of it gave her childhood back. None of it unmade the corridor. What it gave her was something different. It gave her the capacity to stop organizing everything around what had happened, to start organizing things around what was possible. That was not a restoration. It was not a debt paid. It was something more strange and more durable. The particular freedom of a person who has been carrying a specific weight so long that they have become convinced the weight is them, and who discovers, when they finally put it down, that they are still there. Different, tired, more complex in their lines, but present, intact. She sat in the East Tower room until the light changed. Then she went downstairs. Lucien was in the study, his study, the one with the correspondence stacks and the campaign maps and the chair he'd been sitting in when she'd come to him on the night of the 8-word message. He was not at the desk. He was standing at the window, as he often was, with the northern courtyard below and the specific quality of a man using the outside world to anchor himself. She came into the room. He turned. She looked at him across the study's space, the distance she had crossed so many times in the last 3 weeks, each crossing carrying a different weight than the one before it, and she thought about the language she had said she would use when she had it. She had it now. Not all of it. Probably not even most of it. Language for this kind of thing arrived in installments, she suspected, and demanded patience from the people building it together. And patience was something she had considerably more of than she'd had 5 years ago. The things I said about choosing you, she said. The political reasons, the assessment. Yes. They were true, she said. I know. And, she said, also. He waited. When you told me that the East Tower had 1 corridor and 1 stairwell and 3 walls against solid rock, she said, and that it was the second most defensible room in the castle, and I asked about the most defensible. And I said mine, he said. Yes. She looked at him. I didn't know then why that mattered. I told myself it was tactical, a statement about allocation of defensive resources. Was it? Partly, she said. And partly it was the first time in 5 years that someone had said a thing to me that was not about the situation, that was about, she found it. Position, where you placed yourself relative to where I was, not politically, just where. He looked at her. I didn't realize I was doing it, he said. I know, she said. That was the part that mattered. The study was quiet. The northern courtyard below held the early evening sounds of a castle resettling into itself after days of disruption. The guard rotation changing, the stable work concluding, the specific ordinary sounds of a household that had held through something significant and was now, carefully, continuing. He crossed the room. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly, and close enough that she could see the specific quality of his exhaustion, the 4 days in the pass and the 40-mile ride and the cracked ribs and everything underneath all of that. The accumulated weight of a man who had been standing at the point of maximum exposure for as long as he could remember, and who was, she thought, as disoriented by the absence of immediate emergency as she was. The East Tower, he said, if you want to stay there. I don't want the East Tower, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. I know, he said. He put his hand against her face, not tentative, not the gesture of a man asking permission, but the gesture of someone who has made a decision and is now executing it with the same clean directness he applied to everything. And she let her forehead rest against his, and they stood like that in the study with the northern evening coming in, and the sounds of the castle continuing below, and the exhaustion of everything they'd been through sitting between them. Not as a barrier, but as evidence, the specific evidence of 2 people who had been through the same fire in adjacent positions and had both come out the other side. Not unchanged, not unscathed, but present.
The empire did not transform in a week or a month or a season. It transformed the way all large things transformed, slowly, imperfectly, with resistance from the parts that had organized themselves around the old shape and were not yet convinced the new shape was stable. The council adjudication took 4 months to complete. The regent's eastern exile was formalized in the 5th month. Hale provided the names and the documentation the supplementary inquiry required, and the inquiry built on those foundations for another 6, and the lords who had been waiting to see which way things resolved began, gradually, to commit to a shape they could read as settled. The distributed model took years. She had known it would take years. She worked through the years with the same methodical patience that had carried her through the 5 before, except different in this. Now the work was building rather than surviving, and building was, she found, a fundamentally different activity than surviving, despite the superficial similarities. Surviving required you to maintain what existed against what threatened it. Building required you to hold in your mind something that didn't yet exist and make decisions in the present that served the future version rather than the current one. She was better at surviving. She was learning building. Lucien was better at building than he knew, and she told him so at intervals, which he received with the specific discomfort of someone who had been defined for so long by the capacity for force that being defined by something else required adjustment. He adjusted. That was, she thought, the thing she had not adequately accounted for in any of her models. The capacity for adjustment. The specific quality in a person that allowed them to receive accurate information about themselves and revise, not defensively, not with the performance of revision, but with the genuine internal restructuring that real change required. He was, she had come to understand, the most genuinely adjustable person she had ever known. Underneath the reputation and the stillness and the controlled deployment of exactly sufficient force, underneath all of it was a man who had decided, at some point she couldn't identify, that accuracy mattered more than consistency, that being correct was more important than being the thing he'd always been. That quality was rare. She had not known how rare until she'd been close enough to observe it over time. On a morning in the first spring after everything, she stood at the window of a room in Castle Varellis that was not the East Tower and was not the servants' quarters, and was not a room she would have been admitted to 14 months ago. And she looked at the northern courtyard below where Lena was crossing with a stack of documents under her arm. Actual documents now, not stolen ones, produced by the formal educational arrangement that Seraphine had organized with a tutor from the capital who came twice a week. And she thought about the word home. She had not used the word in 12 years. She was considering it. Lucien came into the room from behind her. He was moving better. The ribs had healed over the winter with the specific resentful slowness of injuries sustained in middle age, and the improvement was apparent in the way he occupied the room now versus 6 months ago. He stood beside her at the window. Below, Lena disappeared through the kitchen entrance with her documents. "She wants to apprentice with the council's administrative office," Seraphine said. "In the spring. She asked me last week." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd arrange it," she said. "That the administrative office needed people who understood how the machinery looked from both sides." He looked at her. "You told a 17-year-old kitchen girl that she was going to work for the High Council." "I told her the truth," she said, "which is that she's already been teaching herself the work for 2 years, and the only thing missing was the official context." He was quiet for a moment. "You do this constantly," he said. "Do what?" "Find the person inside the situation," he said. "Give them the accurate information and let them decide." She looked at the courtyard. "I learned it," she said, "from observation." He looked at her. The morning light was the specific quality of northern spring, still cold, but present in a way that winter light wasn't, with the particular honesty of a season that didn't pretend to be warmer than it was, but showed up anyway, reliably, after every winter without exception. She had spent 12 years in winter. She was in the early part of something else. "Seraphine," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the library the first time, with the pure, unself-conscious directness of a man whose model of the world had just required significant revision and who was mildly startled to find her there, except now the revision was complete, and what replaced startlement was something that had been building over seasons into a form she could finally name. "Yes," she said. "I haven't said anything yet," he said. "No,"
she said. "But I know what you're going to say. And the answer is yes." He looked at her for a moment. "You planned for this too," he said. "No," she said. "This one I didn't plan." She looked at him. "This one," she said, "I arrived at." The northern courtyard below was full of ordinary mourning. The castle around them was full of the sounds of a household doing the specific daily work of existing inside something that was worth maintaining. The empire beyond the walls was doing the slow, difficult, necessary work of becoming something more accurate than what it had been. And the work was imperfect and contested and required more patience than anyone involved in it had expected. She was here. She was not running. She was not surviving. She was, for the first time in 12 years, doing the most ordinary and the most difficult thing available to a person who has been through what she had been through. She was staying. Not because the walls were safe. The walls had never been safe, and she had no illusion they would become safe. Not because the future was certain. She had spent 5 years planning for uncertainty and understood it as the permanent condition of being alive rather than a problem to be eliminated. She was staying because this was what came after. Because after, it turned out, was not a location you arrived at, but a direction you committed to. And the commitment was daily, and the daily was all there was, and the all there was, improbably, sufficient. She turned from the window. She had work to do. They both did. The empire did not restructure itself, and the light in the northern courtyard would not stay still, and the loose stone in the scullery wall was empty now because the girl who had kept lessons there had moved them to a proper desk in a room with a window. The empire remembered them neither as heroes nor as monsters. It remembered them as the people who had stayed when staying cost something, and who had built, out of patience and loss and the specific clarity that arrived only after everything else had burned, something that lasted longer than either of them. Not because it was made of stone, because it was made of the choice to remain, renewed every morning, as ordinary and as difficult as light arriving after winter, as inevitable and as hard-won as spring.